Chapter 41. If you want to support to continue with the chapters and improve the quality of the language, or read some advanced chapters +6, this week I will upload several chapters to Patreon. Please follow me on patreon.com/Jayjayempi. Nate drove along the winding road that connected La Push to Forks, leaving Billy Black's house behind. The engine of his old car purred softly as he kept his eyes on the road, but his mind was racing much faster. He had left his worries behind. Once again, he felt confident. He had all the information he needed. The pieces of the puzzle finally fell into place. The Cullens weren't as dangerous as he had initially believed. At least, not entirely. That didn't make them harmless, but they were more peaceful, more restrained. And with the tacit support of the Quileute tribe, Nate knew he had an ancestral, deep, and real safety net. He had allies. He had a plan. For a moment, as the trees blurred past his window like shifting shadows, he thought about the Cullens with a degree of objectivity. Not all of them seemed to be the problem. Emmett, for example, the big, muscular guy, had been surprisingly friendly. There was something transparent about him. Almost clumsy, but without deception. A guy who laughed loudly and spoke plainly. He didn't seem like the type of creature that crept over rooftops in search of victims. And Carlisle, it was hard not to empathize with him. Even knowing that, in theory, he had to feed on blood, Nate couldn't ignore what he did every day: hospital doctor. Saving lives. Helping people. How does someone like him resist his impulses? Maybe they fed on blood from the hospital, Nate thought. That wouldn't be the worst thing, considering the alternative. And Alice. Nate squinted, almost reluctantly. Her soft voice. Her mischievous smile, the way her eyes looked at him and seemed to understand him. There was something special about her. Something kind. A discreet, sincere sweetness. A way of speaking that seemed genuinely excited to uncover what lay beneath Nate's armor. But he shook his head, literally. He couldn't allow himself that. He couldn't fall for appearances. He already knew enough not to be fooled. Edward Cullen was still a direct threat to Bella, no matter how much he tried to restrain himself. He could fight his nature all he wanted, but the smallest mistake, a single slip, and she'd be dead. Nate wasn't willing to let that happen. Bella was still young. She had no idea what it really meant to love someone like Edward. She was idealizing him, blinded by mystery and intensity. Eventually, she'd meet other people, Nate thought. Maybe Jacob would even manage to get closer to her. That made him smile. For a moment, he pictured his two friends together, Bella laughing, Jacob looking at her with that goofy, adoring expression that was already starting to show. He could help a little, he told himself. Gently nudge things in that direction, for both their sakes. But before playing matchmaker, there was a more urgent goal. Getting rid of the Cullens. Or at least, making them leave Forks. Nate had already started categorizing them as vampires, because, in the end, that's what they were. Everything matched the classic folklore. He no longer cared how different they claimed to be. If they had a need to feed on human life, superhuman strength, golden eyes, and cold skin, they were monsters, period. No matter how human they tried to seem. And Edward, he was Nate's main concern. The most emotional, the most unstable. The one, in Nate's eyes, with the highest chance of hurting Bella. But also the easiest to provoke. Edward was afraid of Nate. He had seen it in his eyes the day he discovered his secret. He already felt cornered, and now, with the certainty that he couldn't lay a hand on him, it was only a matter of time. He just had to scare him enough to make him leave. As he neared his house, his phone vibrated in his pocket. He pulled it out with one hand, still driving. It was a message from Bella. Are you free this afternoon? I wanted to go out for a bit and chat. After all, you must be even more bored than I am. Nate smiled. Bored would be the last word he'd use to describe himself right now. He replied without hesitation. Sounds great. I'll pick you up after school. I can ask Charlie to send someone for your truck. A few seconds later, another message. I wouldn't want to trouble Charlie, but after everything that happened yesterday, I don't think he'll mind. I'll be waiting after school. Oh, and by the way, I gave your number to Alice Cullen. Well, actually, I gave it to Edward, but he said it was for his sister. Nate paused for a second. Edward wasn't wasting any time. It seemed both sides had decided to be proactive. Perfect. Even if he couldn't drive them away, he could at least make Bella's opinion of Edward worsen. The fact that Edward might come looking for him only played in his favor. He replied. No problem. I hope she gets in touch soon. A few seconds later, Bella responded in a playful tone. Didn't think you were the direct type. Hope you have good luck with Alice. Nate laughed again, shaking his head. Convenient misunderstandings, he thought. For now, he wasn't going to correct her. Letting Bella think that only worked in his favor. As the sun began to filter through the eternal clouds of Forks, Nate parked in front of his house with a light heart. He was closer than ever to keeping Bella safe. And to make the fog of monsters surrounding her vanish forever. And best of all, now, everything finally felt under control. Creation is hard, cheer me up. Jayjayempi Creators Thoughts. 29 comments 0 vote. Chapter 42. If you want to support to continue with the chapters and improve the quality of the language, or read some advanced chapters +6 this week, I will upload several chapters to Patreon. Please follow me on patreon.com/jjmp. Once Nate stepped inside his house, he closed the door softly behind him and decided to relax for a bit before classes ended. He made his way to the desk and flipped through his father's journal once more. He found no classic vampire weaknesses, garlic, crosses, stakes, but he reviewed the Quileute legends, reminded of the power of the community that protected him. It hadn't been a waste of time. When it was time to pick up Bella, he dressed carefully, a comfortable gray t-shirt and dark jeans. Before leaving, he took one last look in the mirror, straightened his collar, and made sure he looked presentable. Ready, he murmured and stepped out. The drive to the school felt incredibly short. He arrived a few minutes before the final bell, parked near the main entrance, and leaned his back against the car, arms crossed. Around him, the air was thick with murmurs, muffled laughter, whispers rising like waves. Suddenly, he heard, "That's Nate Winter, isn't it? They say he knocked Mike out with one punch just for getting close to Bella. I don't know what they see in Bella, honestly." Nate fixed his gaze on the horizon, unfazed. Let them talk, he thought. People swallow any rumor. He took a sip of coffee from his thermos and smiled with the calm of someone who doesn't care about public opinion. The final bell rang, a metallic crash that unleashed the crowd. Students poured out in torrents, vibrant flashes of backpacks and jackets. Nate remained still, scanning every face. Through the sea of teenagers, he spotted Bella. She walked with steady steps, but not alone. Beside her was Edward Cullen. He leaned in to whisper something in her ear, one hand barely brushing Bella's arm. Their proximity was obvious, almost deliberate. A spark of warning flashed through Nate's mind. Looks like he's made up his mind. He's not conflicted like before, now he's determined to get close to her. Nate gave a bright, friendly smile as if lit from within. He straightened his shirt and, noticing Edward glance his way, raised a hand in a friendly wave as he walked forward with measured steps. "Bella," he called warmly when he was close enough. "I hope you're hungry. I haven't eaten anything since this morning." She finally registered his presence, gave a small smile, and replied, "I could eat, you know the food here leaves something to be desired. Thanks for coming to get me. I hope Charlie doesn't mind sending someone for my truck." Nate laughed softly, noticing how dreamy Bella looked with Edward by her side, though he pretended not to. "Not at all. I called him before I came, and he sounded happy. After yesterday, he wasn't thrilled about you driving. Well, you know, you can crash into cars without being behind the wheel." Bella let out a light giggle and squinted at Nate in playful accusation. Then, as if only just aware of him, Nate turned to Edward and extended his hand in a casual gesture, his face open. "Edward, good morning. You look in good spirits. Did school treat you well today?" Edward hesitated, glanced at Bella for a moment, then took Nate's hand with a cold, brief grip. "It's been a pleasant morning, thank you." Inside, Nate muttered loud enough for Edward to hear, "Are you keeping your lunch company, monster? Want to head into the woods so she can see what you are? You seem to enjoy playing with your food." But outside, his smile remained unchanged. "I'm glad to hear it. Bella and I are going for a walk and grabbing a bite to eat. Why don't you join us? You look hungry." Edward frowned, clearly uncomfortable, almost annoyed, and took a step back. No, thanks. I really must be going." He said it tensely, looking at Bella with a mixture of apology and urgency. "I'm sorry, Bella. See you tomorrow." With a nearly imperceptible movement, he walked away, casting one last look at Nate before melting into the crowd. Nate watched him go, then turned back to Bella with an innocently curious expression. "Did I say something wrong? He didn't seem too happy to see me." His voice was soft, almost confidential. Bella shook her head, thoughtful. "No, he just got weird. We were talking so animatedly until a moment ago, I don't know what happened." Well, that's strange, Nate said, furrowing his brow briefly, just enough for Bella to notice. Then he returned to his slightly awkward smile. Maybe he doesn't like me much. Bella looked at him for a few seconds and placed her hand on his arm in a reassuring gesture. I don't think so, Nate. Edward is very kind, maybe he just needs to get to know you better. I have a feeling you two could become great friends. Nate nodded as they headed back toward the car. I hope so. I'll try talking more with him. If he ever becomes your boyfriend, I shouldn't make a bad impression. He added the last part in a teasing tone. Bella blushed and gave him a light punch on the arm. Shut up, Nate. We're just friends. He said he hoped we'd get along. Also, if you keep getting close to his sister, it'd be smart to win over the rest of his family, right? Nate simply smiled, neither confirming nor denying anything. Just as they were about to get into the car, a melodious voice called out. Nate, wait a moment, please. Almost as if summoned, Alice Cullen appeared behind them, her hand raised to stop them and concern etched across her face. Creation is hard, cheer me up. Jayjayempi creators' thoughts. 32 comments 0 vote. Chapter 43. If you want to support to continue with the chapters and improve the quality of the language, or read some advanced chapters +6 this week, I will upload several chapters to Patreon. Please follow me on patreon.com/jjmp. Nate had his hand on the driver's door, already half leaning into the car. Bella was getting comfortable in the passenger seat, crossing her legs with that studied nonchalance she adopted when she was in a good mood. The engine was still off, but the air in the parking lot felt charged with static electricity. Then, a melodic voice, soft but clear, reached him just before he fully opened the door. Nate, wait a moment, please. Nate raised an eyebrow, turning slowly on his heels. It was Alice Cullen. She stood a few meters away, her hands clasped in front of her and a strangely serious expression on her face. The wind played with the hem of her light coat. Bella didn't seem to notice her, still busy rummaging through her backpack. Nate partially closed the door and took a few steps toward her, a slight frown forming on his face. He liked Alice, or at least, he didn't dislike her the way he did Edward. But the idea of one of the Cullens hovering around Bella still triggered something primal in him, the instinct to push them away, to protect her. Alice didn't raise her voice, but her words, whispered with precision, reached his ears. I understand you don't trust us, Nate. I know something in you picks up on things. And I won't pretend there aren't reasons for your reluctance. Nate narrowed his eyes, scrutinizing her face. He didn't detect any falsehood. That disarmed him a little. Us. Did you come to speak for all the Cullens, or did your brother send you out here on PR duty? Alice shook her head, a soft half-smile crossing her lips. Edward doesn't know I'm here. Carlyle wouldn't agree with this, either. But I don't think avoiding each other is the solution. I've seen what happens every time you and Edward interact. It always ends badly, for him. And that worries you? Nate asked, without sarcasm, just genuine curiosity. It worries me what that says about how you see us. Alice lowered her voice a bit, her tone becoming more personal. I want to understand you. I think if we spoke honestly, we could, maybe not trust, but at least coexist. Nate didn't answer right away. He looked toward his car. Bella was still rummaging. She hadn't heard any of it. He turned back to Alice. And what makes you think I need to coexist with you? If I feel like something's off, why not just cut the risk now? Alice held his gaze, serious, but not harsh. Because not all risks are what they seem. Because we didn't come here to hurt anyone. And you know that. If you'd listen to me for more than a minute, you'd feel it. Nate inhaled deeply. He sensed no lies in her words. Alice spoke with a sincerity so transparent it was almost uncomfortable. His resolve to push them away, especially Edward, was beginning to waver. All right, he finally said, lowering his voice slightly. I'll give you the benefit of the doubt. You and I will talk later. Alone. Alice smiled, an honest smile, not one meant to impress. She nodded with gratitude, and then as if the universe had conspired to complicate things, Bella's voice reached them from the car. Nate turned to look. There was a playful gleam in her eyes, like someone planning something fun. Alice, are you free right now? Nate and I are going to drive around town. Maybe grab something to eat. Wanna come? Alice blinked, surprised. Nate turned his head toward Bella, then back to Alice. Discomfort painted his features. He hadn't expected to share lunch with a vampire. Judging by Alice's slight expression, neither had she. Bella got out of the car with her innocent smile, unaware of the tension. She walked toward them, backpack slung over one shoulder. Come on, it'll be fun. Nate says you're nice. It'd be a great way to hang out. Nate immediately understood. Bella thought the tension was something romantic, and this was her way of helping him. Alice looked at her with a mixture of tenderness and apprehension. She knew that depending on how things played out, they could be friends, maybe even something like sisters. Nate said nothing, still gauging how he felt about the whole situation. Are you sure? Alice asked, though it was obvious Bella meant it. Yes. Besides, Nate needs more friends. He only has me, Jacob, and coffee in his life. Nate chuckled under his breath. And honestly, it's less complicated being alone with coffee. Bella gave him a playful elbow. Don't be grumpy. Alice looked at Nate, reading his silence. He exhaled softly through his nose, barely audible. It seemed he was resigning himself to the idea. After all, there wasn't much difference between having that conversation today or some other day. All right. It'll be fun, Nate said in a low tone. Alice nodded with an amused smile. Didn't expect anything less. The three of them headed to the car. Bella happily got back into the passenger seat. Alice opened the back door and settled in with an almost unnatural grace. Nate walked around the front of the car slowly, still unsure how this odd outing was going to end. From across the parking lot, a pale, motionless figure watched them. Jasper Hale, half hidden behind an old car, had observed the scene from a distance. His brow was furrowed, hands tense in his pockets. He knew Alice was taking a risk. He knew Carlyle wouldn't approve. And yet, something in his expression showed more fear for her than for whatever might happen with Nate. When Nate finally started the car, the tires crunched softly against the gravel. The afternoon was starting to turn golden, and the vehicle pulled slowly out of the parking lot with its three passengers, leaving behind a school, a secret, and an anxious gaze that faded into the rearview mirror. Have some idea about my story? Comment it and let me know. Creation is hard, cheer me up. Jayjayempi creators' thoughts. 19 comments 0 vote. Chapter 44. If you want to support to continue with the chapters and improve the quality of the language, or read some advanced chapters +6 this week, I will upload several chapters to Patreon. Please follow me on patreon.com/jjmp. The car glided through the streets of Forks at the unhurried pace of a lazy afternoon. From the passenger seat, Bella leaned toward the window, elbow resting on the edge, her head slightly turned to speak with Alice, who sat in the back with her hands folded on her lap. It's a shame it rains so much here, Bella said. I feel like if we lived somewhere sunnier, we could make more exciting plans. Alice smiled. The weather has its charm. Though I admit, I wouldn't mind seeing a few more sunny days. Nate, behind the wheel, commented without taking his eyes off the road. I always thought you and your siblings would burst into flames if the sun hit you. You know, because of how pale you are. Alice laughed, catching the real meaning behind the joke. Bella just looked at him, raising her eyebrows. Are you including me in that too? Bella asked with a teasing smile. A little sun wouldn't hurt you, Nate said, with a small grin. But who knows, maybe you ran away from Phoenix because of it. Alice looked amused. Wow, you're quite the charmer, Nate, she said with playful sarcasm. The car kept moving as the girls resumed a lively conversation. Bella seemed especially enthusiastic about Alice. They laughed and shared short anecdotes. Alice was effortlessly charming, and although Nate kept his emotional distance, he couldn't help but feel less defensive. His initial intention of keeping the Cullens away was starting to feel less certain, at least with her. What about Edward? Bella asked naturally. What's he like at home? Sometimes he feels hard to figure out. Alice tilted her head slightly. Edward has many layers. But deep down, he's simpler than he seems. He just wants to do the right thing. He's really good. Bella smiled, almost shyly. Yeah, he does seem like someone who cares a lot. Maybe too much sometimes. Nate stared straight ahead, his jaw tense. He stayed silent. Alice noticed. What do you think, Nate? Bella asked, without any hidden intent. What was your impression of Edward? Nate took a second. Then he muttered, he's reserved. I don't know him well enough to say. Alice looked at him with interest. She felt a bit of admiration for how naturally Nate sidestepped the question. Bella nodded. That's what I thought. You two should spend more time together. You're kind of alike. You both have that smart but mysterious vibe. I don't think we're alike. We have different natures, Nate murmured, just loud enough for Alice to hear. She raised an eyebrow slightly in response. A few minutes later, they stopped at a gas station on the edge of town. Nate turned off the engine and said, I'm going in to grab a snack. Want anything? I'm good, Alice replied. Me too, said Bella. Thanks. Nate stepped out of the car. As soon as he walked a few steps away, Bella turned to Alice with a smile that was a little smug, something rare in her. I think Nate likes you. Alice blinked, surprised. What? Yeah. It makes sense, doesn't it? I've heard him mention you before, and he sounded interested. Besides, he usually avoids girls. You have no idea how many times Jessica's tried to talk me into planning a group hangout, and with you, he agreed right away. You should think about it. He's handsome and funny, and he has that protective air that makes you feel safe. I don't even think he realizes it, but he's totally into you. Alice looked at her with fondness, immediately understanding Bella's misunderstanding. Do you think that? Absolutely. And you should know Nate isn't like that with just anyone. He's selective. Sometimes too much. But you're different, I can tell. Alice didn't respond right away. She glanced toward the store where Nate had disappeared, then smiled, mostly to herself. He seems like a great guy, she said softly. Then she looked at Bella and added, lowering her voice with a hint of mischief, Edward is really good too, you know. Bella blushed. Alice, are you trying to sell me your brother now? I'm just saying, some people are worth it. Edward is shy, despite what he seems. You just have to give him time, and you'll get to know him. Bella shook her head, laughing. You sound just like Nate. He told me something similar. About Edward? Asked Alice. Sort of. Honestly, I wanted to ask your brother a few things, but Nate told me to give it time. I think he meant I should get to know him first, or at least that's how I took it. Alice was still thinking about that when the car door opened again. Nate returned with a small bag of snacks. He looked at them with a raised eyebrow. Did I miss something? Alice smiled, charming. Just a girl's talk. That sounds like a conspiracy, Nate said as he got in. Bella laughed, offering no further details. They kept driving a while longer until Bella looked at her phone. Oh, I almost forgot. I have to email my mom. Can you drop me off at home, Nate? He glanced at her, immediately catching the hint. Sure, he replied neutrally. When they arrived, Bella unbuckled her seatbelt, opened the door, and paused for a second. She leaned toward Nate and whispered with a grin. Don't waste the opportunity. He responded seriously. I won't. However, for Nate, the purpose was something else entirely. Bella nodded, pleased, and got out of the car. She turned to Alice. Thanks for coming. That was fun. Alice waved her hand with her usual bubbly flair, almost theatrical. See you soon. Now alone with Nate, she slid into the front seat with graceful movements. The car returned to the road, quieter this time. Nate didn't speak at first. Alice broke the silence gently. Bella's convinced you like me. Did you know that? Nate let out a soft laugh through his nose. I know. She hasn't exactly been subtle about it. Alice looked at him, interested but without pressing. And what do you think? Nate sighed. I think there are a lot of questions between you and me. Alice nodded. She looked back at the road. Then let's talk. The car continued forward, driving into the setting sun. This would be the first honest conversation they would have, without filters. Creation is hard, cheer me up. Jayjayempi creators' thoughts. 14 comments 0 vote. Chapter 45. If you want to support to continue with the chapters and improve the quality of the language, or read some advanced chapters +8, this week I will upload several chapters to Patreon, please follow me on patreon.com/jjmp. The car came to a gentle stop by the curb, in front of a silent park that was beginning to empty. The sky was no longer purely blue nor entirely gray, it lingered in that in-between moment when sunset seemed to hold its breath before yielding completely to night. The park's lampposts were on, casting warm circles of light over the damp paths and empty benches. Nate switched off the engine and leaned back slightly, letting the silence drift through the cabin for a moment. Then he turned toward Alice. So, how do you propose we do this? Alice had her hands folded in her lap, her gaze attentive but calm. One of those looks that neither pressures nor retreats. She gave a small smile. Like a continuation of our game, she said. Remember, the question and answer game in English class. Nate studied her for another second, sizing her up as he always did. There was something almost provocative in how relaxed she was. All right, he finally said. But this time on one condition. Alice tilted her head, curious. No lies, Nate added, dropping his voice. The first one I catch, the game's over. And so is this peacemaking attempt. Alice's smile faded slowly, not from annoyance, but because she understood the seriousness behind his words. She nodded deliberately as if sealing an important pact. Agreed, she said, her tone no longer light but firm. Not a single lie, not even half-truths. Ladies first, Nate remarked casually. Sure. Let me see, how do you feel being in such an isolated place with a vampire? Alice asked, smiling to show her teeth. Nate considered it for a moment. The promise of honesty hung in the air, and in the spirit of greater transparency, he decided to play by her rules. Nervous. It's like being trapped with a sleeping lion. It feels as if any sudden move could wake it, and make it attack me, Nate said gravely. But it's also strange. You look so human, like any girl my age, yet, your presence feels like a lamppost. I unconsciously want to come closer, as if something primitive in my mind is urging me to give into whatever I want. Alice pondered his words for a second, then spoke. That's normal. We have that effect on humans. Almost everyone ends up mesmerized when they're close enough. It's like a mechanism of our species. We're made to prey on humans, and we adapted to make them easier to catch. I don't think we needed that feature, but if it makes you feel better, I'd say you handled it better than most, she replied, her tone serious, almost like a professor explaining a complex theory. Nate thought for a moment, then flashed a self-satisfied smile. That doesn't count as an answer, since I didn't ask it. So it's still my turn. Alice narrowed her eyes for a second before nodding and returning his smile. Exactly what does your family feed on, and why did they decide not to consume humans? Nate asked, anticipation in his eyes. Alice looked at him for a moment and shrugged as if she'd already expected the question. Honestly, I thought you'd already know. We feed on blood, like any other of our kind, but we choose animal blood. In part, it's all thanks to Carlyle. He taught us a different way of life. We're not monsters, we just live. At least, none of my family wishes to harm anyone. That's not who we are. Nate watched her, realizing there were no lies in her words. For a moment, he felt guilty for having called Edward a monster so many times, though he still harbored reservations. Even so, he promised himself to give him the benefit of the doubt next time they met. Seeing Nate fall silent, Alice quickly pointed a finger at herself and asked playfully. It's my turn, right? Nate simply nodded. Alice stared into his bright amber eyes before asking the question she'd been holding back. How do you do it? How can you discover so many things? We've lived among humans for decades, and you're the first to uncover our secret. And more, you're the only one who's figured out Edward's gift. Nate frowned for a second. It was hard to explain since he'd never told anyone. He took a breath and said. I can't explain how I do it. I've always felt it's instinctive, like my mind points things out to me. Don't get me wrong, I'm not being modest, I know I'm smart and observant. But that instinct, it's like it hands me the pieces, highlights everything important, and my mind just puts them together, making the answer easier to reach. Alice only nodded as she listened. It's something like my visions, or Edward's mind reading. What you're describing sounds like a gift, though on a smaller scale. Nate stared at her for a few seconds. Do you have visions? How much can you see? Then he murmured to himself in a low voice. They can't be perfect visions, or they'd have known I was investigating, and they'd have left. Alice laughed, a nearly musical, genuine sound. There you go again. I just mentioned something and you've already uncovered what would take the most hours. She cleared her throat before replying. My visions are pretty subjective. They're driven more by choices than anything else. I can't see you clearly in them for that very reason. Every time I have a vision about you, it doesn't take long before it shifts. It's strange, and a bit annoying. She wrinkled her nose at the end. Nate smiled, partly relieved not to be under the gaze of such a convenient power. Is it normal for people to have those abilities? Alice thought for a moment, then answered. Edward says he was always good at reading people. Before becoming a vampire, it was as if he had his ability already, just on a smaller scale. Gifts aren't that common, but they're not unheard of. Many humans have special things. One example is Bella, who somehow can't be read by Edward's mind reading. That's pretty rare, because his ability works even on other vampires. Nate now understood why Edward was so interested in Bella. In a world full of open doors, the only one you want to open is the one that stays closed. Alice fell silent for a few seconds as if giving Nate time to process before continuing their game. Why do you insist on keeping Edward away from Bella? Nate noticed Alice's brow furrowing as she asked. He let out a sigh. He felt reluctant to answer, but finally spoke. I was never alone as a kid. I always knew how to shine around others, but at the cost of masks, pretending interest, or in a way, manipulating those around me. With my abilities, it was always too easy to be perfect in others' eyes. He paused, took a deep breath, and continued. But there were people who stood by me unconditionally. People who loved me just as I was. With them, I didn't have to pretend or analyze, I just had to be Nate. They were like a ray of sunshine in an existence as cold as mine. Alice watched him, forgetting even to blink. But when they died, I was devastated. Everything in my life felt fake, pure appearance. When I lost what was real, nothing else mattered. Pretending no longer mattered. Understanding didn't either. I felt empty. Honestly, part of me wanted to end it all, but I felt it wasn't what my parents would have wanted. I ended up in Forks and focused on the first thing I found, the memory of my father. Thanks to him, in a way, I reached out to others. First Charlie, Billy, Jake, and then Bella. Before I knew it, what started as a distraction became something real. I began to care about these people. They're kind, they're good, and they're transparent. And bit by bit, they earned a place in my life. That's why I don't want to lose them again. Even if it forces me to do things I don't want to do, I'll do whatever it takes to keep them safe. Alice remained silent, her hand reaching out to rest on Nate's. The chill sent a shiver through him, but he made no move to pull away. They stayed that way for a few seconds until Nate removed his hand and cleared his throat. I didn't mean to make the atmosphere so heavy. I think we should move on. Alice watched him for a moment, then nodded and said. Now I understand why you protect her so much. I won't take Edward's side anymore. I think that's something you two need to work out on your own. Nate nodded, promising himself he would talk to Edward, but that would be for another time. Now he felt more intrigued by the person in front of him. Since it's my turn, I'm curious. Alice raised an eyebrow, waiting. Nate settled back in his seat and turned toward her before speaking. Where do vampires come from? Alice's expression shifted immediately. She grew serious and began to speak. Centuries ago, in a distant land, a man, gripped by fear of his mortality, fervently wished for eternal life. In his desperation, he committed despicable acts and did the unthinkable to achieve his goal. In the end, none of his efforts bore fruit and, like any mortal, he reached his deathbed. Lying there, helpless, he prayed to every deity known and unknown, until, finally, one answered his plea. That deity promised him youth and eternal life, but in return, he must with his own hands snuff out the lives of innocent people. The man, already corrupted to the core, accepted the bargain, and thus became the first vampire. Nate's eyes widened, completely incredulous. He whispered. Are you serious? No, Alice replied, unable to contain a laugh. Nate, who had been frozen, couldn't help but laugh at the absurdity of it all. Sorry, Alice said playfully. I know we said no lies, but I had to do something to lighten the mood. Nate, incapable of being upset by such a good joke, simply asked again. Then, where do vampires come from? Alice shrugged and responded. The truth is, nobody knows. Carlyle has met vampires thousands of years old, and they all say the same thing, they were turned by another vampire. Nate stared at her for a moment, as if searching for traces of a lie in her words. Alice raised her hands in a defensive gesture and continued. When you have immortality like we do, details like that cease to matter. You'd be surprised how little most of our kind care about origins. Nate, though still a bit confused, chose to believe in the goodwill that had been shown so far and trusted Alice's words. Alice, seeing that her answer had satisfied him, merely smiled. The atmosphere had become unexpectedly comfortable. The game was forgotten without either of them noticing, and only pleasant conversation followed as if they'd both agreed to stop probing and simply learn about each other. Nate stretched a little. After all, they'd been sitting in the car for quite some time, yet neither was bored. He observed her for a few seconds, then, in a low tone almost as if regretting what he was about to say, asked. Tell me something, don't you miss being human? Alice didn't need much thought before replying. Actually, I don't remember my time as a human. Nate, puzzled, simply raised an eyebrow. Alice offered a somewhat sad smile and continued. My earliest memories are from when I was already a vampire. I remember feeling lost back then, luckily, my visions guided me. I didn't take long to investigate my past. I discovered I'd been confined in a psychiatric hospital because of those visions. I found my real name and a few scant details, nothing too relevant. Honestly, at this point, it doesn't matter. I left all that behind and carried on with my own life. Nate empathized with Alice and smiled at her kindly. At least you found a home with the Cullens, right? Did your visions lead you to them? Alice hesitated for a moment before answering, as if reluctant to continue the story, but finally, her expression turned determined and she said, my visions led me to Jasper. I saw a future where he was my partner and we were with the Cullens. After that, I saw myself happy, and surrounded by my new family. For a long time, that image helped me through my lonely days. Nate, visibly uncomfortable, couldn't hold back his question. I thought Jasper was interested in you, but I believed you weren't a couple. Alice met his gaze and replied without blinking. We're not. My visions show me various futures, nothing is set in stone. When I found Jasper, he was involved with someone else. I know we said no half-truths, but it's not my place to tell you about his life. To sum it up, Jasper at that time was in love with someone who didn't return his feelings. Nate grimaced and added, that must have been hard. Alice smiled sadly. You have no idea, for vampires, emotions like love are stronger. Usually, our bonds are eternal. We choose a mate and remain with them forever. It's very rare to hear of a vampire having more than one bond like the one I'm describing. In Jasper's case, he agreed to come with me, mostly because he had nowhere else to go. But nothing happened between us. Jasper spent decades thinking about his old love. Only after a long time did he begin to look for me. Bit by bit we grew closer, we formed a sibling-like bond, but I didn't want it to go any further. Honestly, when I saw him in my visions, I thought the bond would be instantaneous, but it wasn't. I was excited because I thought he would be my home, but after years of rejection, he confirmed that the future isn't carved in stone. Nate swallowed hard at the revelation. He could only imagine the sadness she must have felt after years in darkness, with the only comfort of visions that ultimately didn't come true. Alice lowered her gaze, her brow heavy with sorrow. Nate, unconsciously carried away by the feeling of being near her, a feeling he'd contained since their first meeting, took her by the chin and gently lifted her face. He leaned in slowly. Alice looked surprised but moved closer of her own accord. Just as they were about to touch, Alice's phone rang, shattering the atmosphere they'd created in an instant. Nate didn't jerk back, instead, he slowly returned to his seat and exhaled sharply. He recognized that he'd let himself be dazzled for a moment and tried to calm his racing mind. Alice, on the other hand, stayed still for a few seconds before checking her phone. Seeing an incoming call from Jasper, she frowned and glanced around. Her eyes narrowed just before she declined the call. They sat in silence for several minutes until Nate decided to break it. I think I'll take you home, it's late, and I think I need to rest. Alice simply nodded in response. The drive to the Cullens' house remained quiet. 61 comments, 0 vote. Chapter 46. If you want to support to continue with the chapters and improve the quality of the language, or read some advanced chapters +8, this week I will upload several chapters to Patreon. Please follow me on patreon.com/Jayjayempi. Silence filled the car as they slowly made their way along the winding road that cut through the forest. The headlights sliced through the darkness in soft beams, and the sound of the tires on the damp asphalt was their only companion. Alice kept her eyes fixed on the road, occasionally giving quiet directions, though both of them knew something else lingered in the air. After several minutes, Alice broke the silence with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. You know, I think I'd get there faster if I just ran. Nate let out a small chuckle through his nose, grateful for the attempt to ease the tension. Of course, you'd get there faster, he said, but I'd be a terrible host if I let you go alone. Besides, Bella will want to know I made sure you got home and didn't throw yourself off the roof the moment no one was looking. Alice laughed, this time with a bit more sincerity. You're right. She did seem very insistent that you make the most of it. The car turned into a wide curve as the road lights gradually disappeared. The trees thickened as if the forest were trying to swallow the road, and then Alice pointed toward a narrower turnoff. That way. We're almost there. Nate obeyed, and as the car moved among the darker trees, he frowned slightly. I never would have imagined I'd willingly drive into a vampire family's den. Especially in the middle of the night. Alice shot him an amused look. Oh, don't worry. You're welcome anytime. As long as we don't eat you before you decide to leave. Nate pretended to seriously consider it before replying with a smile. I doubt it. I don't think I'd taste very good. Alice smiled but didn't say anything else. The silence returned between them, not uncomfortable, just dense, as if woven from the threads of what had nearly happened just minutes before. Finally, the car emerged into a clearing. The Cullen house stood tall, lit by soft lights inside. The second-floor windows glowed like open eyes in the night. Nate stopped the car near the entrance but didn't move to get out. From the driver's seat, he looked up. In one of the upstairs windows, he spotted a tall, still figure. Edward. Watching him directly, not even bothering to pretend otherwise. I'm sure everyone else heard the car as soon as we got close, Nate said casually, but only he bothered to come to the window. Alice made a slight grimace, somewhere between amused and resigned. Edward's not exactly comfortable with you. Nate muttered without taking his eyes off the house. The feeling's mutual. Alice lowered her gaze to her hands folded in her lap. The atmosphere seemed about to crack again, but instead, she simply smiled. Even if it didn't go as planned, I think it was a fun ride. Nate looked at her. He didn't respond right away but gave her a faint smile in return. Something in his eyes said he agreed, even if he refused to say it aloud. Alice opened the door and stepped out with her usual grace. She walked a few steps toward the house but suddenly stopped and turned to him. You know, now that you're suspended from school, I have no way to contact you. Nate raised an eyebrow in a slightly teasing gesture. He pulled out his phone, calmly recited his number aloud, and added. I think this is more practical, or you could just visit my house again. And with that, he started the car and drove away down the road. He didn't look back. Alice stood still for a moment, lips parted slightly. Then she blinked slowly and murmured. He doesn't miss a thing. Just as he was leaving the road that led to the Cullen house, Nate saw lights approaching. A truck was coming from the other end. As they passed each other, Nate turned his head just enough to recognize the driver. Jasper. Their eyes met for less than a second. Long enough to frown. Long enough to understand the other had noticed. The Jeep vanished in the mirrors, and headed toward the house. Then Nate remembered the phone call Alice had received while they were in the car. Inside, he felt conflicted. He kept driving toward the main road. He hadn't gone far when he felt a vibration in his pocket. Carefully, trying not to take his eyes off the road, he pulled out his phone. For a moment, he thought it might be Alice, but when he looked at the screen, he saw the message was from Bella. Nate chuckled softly, surprised at how perfectly timed she'd been. So, did you have fun? Did you make good use of the opportunity I gave you? Nate thought about it for a few minutes but chose not to reply right away. He kept driving. The town felt nearly asleep. It was already very late by the time he got home. He parked the car and entered without any trouble. His grandmother was already asleep. He went upstairs, sat on his bed, and let out a deep sigh. He took out his phone again and reread the message. A recap of the entire night passed through his mind. With a slightly resigned look, he simply replied. Yeah, I think it was an interesting night. Creation is hard, cheer me up. Jayjayempi creators' thoughts. 32 comments 0 vote. Chapter 47. If you want to support to continue with the chapters and improve the quality of the language, or read some advanced chapters +8, this week I will upload several chapters to Patreon. Please follow me on patreon.com/jjmp. It had been a few days since that night with Alice. Quiet days, at least on the surface. Nate had spent them almost entirely at home, partly because he was still suspended, and partly because he needed to think. Not about the suspension, or even about what he did to earn it. That was clear, and he'd do it again if he had to, but about what he'd learned in that car, parked beside a park lit by flickering street lamps. Alice's words kept spinning in his head. The fact that the Cullens chose not to feed on humans, that they tried to live against a nature they hadn't asked for, was, in a way, admirable. Human, even. But that didn't change what Nate had already concluded on his own. Edward Cullen was a risk. It didn't matter how noble his self-control was, or how careful he tried to be. He knew, with the same certainty that let him see through lies, that sooner or later, one way or another, Edward would drag Bella into a world she wasn't ready for. During those days, Bella had sent him an indecent amount of messages. She didn't talk about class, or homework, or Jacob, or any trivial topics. Just one question, disguised in many forms: what happened with Alice after you dropped me off at home? Nate avoided answering directly. He blamed fatigue, and distractions, or said there wasn't much to tell. But the truth was different. Deep down, he didn't want to face it. Not yet. He told himself he had just gotten caught up in the moment, in that brief connection, but he knew it was a poor excuse. Because he still felt it. He'd told her things he'd never told anyone. He had felt understood. Seen. Nate shook his head. It was similar to the feeling he had when she was near. One he had managed to keep in check. He just needed to focus. There were more important things needing his attention. He couldn't let himself get carried away by a brief encounter. But his mind, as if betraying him, kept replaying the closeness he felt during that conversation. And despite all that synergy they had shown, she hadn't sent a single message since. Not one. She's the one who said she wanted to reach out, he muttered with a small grimace, throwing a tennis ball against his bedroom wall, and watching it bounce back again and again. But nothing. Silence. He forced himself not to dwell on it. He knew that if things between Edward and Bella escalated, anything he might feel, whether for Alice or for that unsettling pull she awakened, would end up tangled in something dangerous. Something he couldn't control. And if there was one thing Nate hated, it was losing control. Bella, on the other hand, didn't stop. She had told him how she was now pressing Edward more and more about what happened the day of the van accident. He always dodged the topic with vague answers or by changing the subject. Nate wasn't surprised. What did surprise him was the way Bella told him everything, almost as if she needed his approval. As if, deep down, she knew Nate was the only one who could see what was going on. It almost tempted him to tell her the truth. But Nate knew that wasn't the right thing to do. Even if he didn't like Edward, the secret extended to his family too, and Nate didn't feel he had the right to reveal it. Then Sunday came. The last day before school started again. He woke up early, more out of habit than necessity. There was something in the air. A kind of silent pressure. He grabbed his phone without expecting much, but there it was, a new message. I think it's time we talked. No name. But he didn't need one. For a second, an unconscious smile crept across his lips. He thought maybe it was Alice, finally breaking the silence that had lasted for days. But as soon as he finished reading the sentence, he knew it wasn't. That dry, direct, almost authoritarian tone, it wasn't hers. It was Edward. He remembered Bella had mentioned a few days ago that Edward wanted his number, for his sister. A weak excuse at the time, but enough not to raise suspicions with Bella. He had almost forgotten. With everything that had happened, he thought Edward would do the same as him, take his time. But once again, Edward's impulsiveness won out over his better judgment. Nate stared at the screen for a few seconds, in silence. He had promised himself he would give Edward a chance to convince him. That he would give him the benefit of the doubt. But he knew things wouldn't be that easy. If there was one thing his encounters with Edward had taught him, it was that when they were face to face, Nate became someone else. He was no longer the good friend Bella saw in him, nor the thoughtful, attentive guy he turned into around Alice. When he stood in front of Edward, he became something different. Something fierce. As if the threat Edward posed to his new life pushed him toward the darkest part of his soul. As if it turned him into the real predator. He closed his eyes for a moment, channeling that feeling once more, and buried any remaining doubt. He typed quickly, with determination. In the woods. Near the school. 30 minutes. He didn't add anything else. He didn't need to. He put the phone away and stood up without hurry. He got dressed in comfortable clothes and tied his shoelaces firmly. He didn't know exactly what Edward Cullen expected from that conversation. But he knew that, whatever it was, it would be the end of the conflict between them. For better, or for worse. Creation is hard, cheer me up. Jayjayempi Creators Thoughts. 15 comments 0 vote. Chapter 48. If you want to support to continue with the chapters and improve the quality of the language, or read some advanced chapters +8 this week, I will upload several chapters to Patreon. Please follow me on patreon.com/jjmp. The house was silent, at least to any human ear. For Edward, however, every corner of his home vibrated with thoughts, restrained emotions, and barely hidden tensions. He wandered through the house, crossing the second-floor hallway for the 5th time in less than 10 minutes. Hands in his pockets, jaw clenched. He was irritated, though he couldn't say exactly why. Or maybe he could, and didn't want to admit it. The truth was simple. Uncertainty was killing him. Ever since Alice had come back from her walk with Nate, several days ago, she had adamantly refused to tell him what had happened. I'm not sharing anything, Edward. If you want to know, you'll have to talk to him yourself, she had said. The way she said it had disarmed him more than the words themselves. Alice never spoke to him like that. Not with that calm, guarded seriousness. Almost protective. As if, for once, she was defending someone else, instead of him. The worst part was, she wouldn't let him read her mind. Not that Alice could block him, but her determination stopped him. She had asked him not to, with such a firm, uncharacteristic expression that Edward had given in. And now that decision was eating away at him. His frustration found no relief at home. The air inside the Cullen mansion was thick. Rosalie looked at him with open disdain every time they crossed paths. She blamed him for everything. That Nate had discovered the secret, that Bella was beginning to suspect, that the fragile balance they had worked so hard to preserve was now starting to tremble. She didn't say much, but when she did, her words were sharp as blades. Alice was a different story. Always so bright, so explosive, now walked around distant, distracted. He often saw her typing and erasing messages on her phone. Sometimes she smiled faintly. Sometimes she sighed. Edward had to bite back the urge to pry into her thoughts, but he kept his promise. Barely. And then there was Jasper. Edward wasn't stupid. He'd noticed the change. Jasper was hovering around Alice more than usual. He was no longer the silent, aloof presence he used to be. Something had shifted in his attitude. He was protective, present, far more than normal. Even strange, though Edward couldn't pinpoint exactly why. All of this, coupled with his growing feelings for Bella, something he could no longer deny, even to himself, was pushing him toward an emotional edge he rarely approached. So, that Sunday morning, just after the sun began peeking timidly through the gray clouds, he decided he'd had enough. He took his phone, stopped in the middle of the hallway, and typed a simple message, no sugarcoating. "I think it's time we talked." He sent it without overthinking. He wasn't expecting an immediate reply. Part of him believed Nate would take his time, or even ignore him. But just a couple of minutes later, his phone buzzed. "Meet me in the woods near the school in 30 minutes. Edward stood still for a moment. No signature. No clarification. And yet, Nate understood him instantly. Always one step ahead. Edward closed his eyes, gripping the phone tightly. The anxiety surged. The forest stood quiet, cool beneath the shade of the trees, the early breeze whispering through the leaves like ancient voices. Edward moved between the trunks with controlled speed, making no more sound than the faint crunch of leaves under his boots. The serious look on his face betrayed the tension coiled within. He had left the house shortly after reading Nate's message. He didn't take the Volvo. He didn't want the engine's roar to alert someone who, despite his youth, seemed to measure every move with surgical precision. As he neared the meeting point, he couldn't help but question how strange this all was. Why would this kid summon him to a forest, far from witnesses? Why wasn't he afraid that a Cullen, a vampire, might show up alone? He quickened his pace, instinct whispering that something wasn't right. Did Nate have some kind of ace up his sleeve? And then he saw it. The car was parked among the trees, the engine still faintly warm. Edward closed his eyes, sniffed the air, and quickly picked up the familiar scent, masculine, human, laced with metal and motor oil. He followed it easily, and the two unsettled him. Did Nate want to be found this quickly? It wasn't long before he spotted him. Nate stood leaning against a tree trunk, arms crossed, eyes on the sky with a calm expression as if he had no care in the world. As if he hadn't just invited an immortal creature to an isolated forest. Edward watched him for a few more seconds, scrutinizing. He didn't seem to be carrying anything but his phone, but Edward couldn't shake the nerves sparked by the knife he'd found in Nate's room, the one that could do the impossible, hurt someone like him. Was he faking vulnerability? He stepped forward, deliberately, snapping a branch beneath his boot. Nothing. Nate kept looking up, unfazed. Ignoring me. Edward frowned slightly and tried reading his mind. Silence. Not like with Bella. With her, it was total void. With Nate, it was different. He sensed something, faint echoes of thoughts, flashes of words with no coherence. Like trying to tune into a static-ridden radio station. Suddenly, Nate lowered his head and locked eyes with Edward, a half-smile on his face. "You can't read my thoughts if I'm not thinking about anything," he said calmly, not moving from the tree. "Your gift is useful, but I think I've figured out how to dull it. At least a little." Edward didn't answer right away. He simply observed him, scanning every expression. No fear. Not even tension. Just control. "That's new," he finally murmured. His voice was lower than usual, almost annoyed to admit it. "Most humans can't manipulate their consciousness like that." "Maybe I'm not like most people," Nate replied, pushing away from the trunk and standing tall. "Though I'm sure you already knew that." "Yeah. Since day one," Edward sighed bluntly. "You're not an ordinary person." The forest was still. Branches barely stirred in the morning breeze, and the air smelled of damp earth and resin. Nate had already been there for a few minutes, arms crossed, eyes fixed on the trail leading from behind the school. We both know why we're here, Nate said evenly. Edward remained silent, analyzing him as if weighing the intent behind each word. Finally, he said. I came because we both know this can't go on. Yeah. Because you shouldn't be around Bella, Nate shot back without hesitation. Edward closed his eyes for a second as if the words pained him. You don't understand. I understand more than you think, Nate cut in. I know what you are. I know what your kind does. And as strange as it sounds, I even respect it. But this thing with Bella, I can't let it slide. Edward stepped forward, slowly. He kept his distance, but his voice carried a mix of suppressed rage and sorrow. You think I haven't tried to stay away from her? I did. I thought if I kept my distance, she'd be safe. But then I saw you with her. I saw how she laughed with you. How she looked at you. And you couldn't stand it, Nate said harshly. You couldn't bear the thought of her being happy without you. It's not that simple, Edward exclaimed, stepping again. His eyes burned with intensity. You don't know what it's like, to hear her heart, feel how fragile she is, and still want to be near. Every second with her is a risk. For her. For me. But what am I supposed to do when she's the only thing that makes any of this make sense? You walk away, Nate said, his tone so cold it surprised even him. You let her live. Give her the chance at a normal life, free of monsters and impossible choices. If you love her, you leave. Edward clenched his jaw, lowered his gaze, fighting something inside him. I tried, he whispered. I swear. But it became clear. The day of the accident. The fear in her eyes, and then, the thought that I'd done nothing, that I could have left her to die. Maybe I can protect her. Maybe we can get through whatever's coming. This isn't a game, Edward. I know. His voice echoed through the trees. He quickly lowered his tone, regret flashing across his face. I know. But, don't ask me to walk away like I don't feel anything. Like I can just turn it off. Nate said nothing for a moment. Then, staring into Edward's eyes, he said. It's not about what you feel. It's about what you are. And you know that better than anyone. This ends badly. The way I see it, either you lose control and consume her, or you turn her into something like you. Edward inhaled deeply, more out of habit than necessity. I don't want to turn her. That was never my intention. But I don't want to lose her either. Nate nodded slowly. His eyes locked on Edward's with unwavering firmness. Then you'd better be very sure, he said in a low, serious voice. Because if anything happens to her, if you're the reason Bella gets hurt, I don't care how fast you are, or how many centuries you've lived. I'll find a way to end you. Edward didn't answer immediately. He stared, unmoving, unblinking. But in his amber eyes, something sparked, not fear, not anger, but recognition. Nate wasn't speaking from pride. He meant it. As a promise. Is an inevitable truth. Is that a threat? Edward asked, though the answer was clear. No, Nate replied coldly. It's a warning. And not just from me. If you lose control of Bella, you're putting your family at risk too. You know that, don't you? Edward's eyes narrowed slightly. Nate continued. The Quileute have already noticed you circling her. They've kept the treaty for years, but if you mess up, they won't stand by. Not if they believe you're breaking the rules. And if war breaks out, no one wins. Edward took a deep breath, jaw clenched tight. You think I haven't thought about that? Tortured me with every possibility. Not enough, Nate said. Because you're still here. Still showing up around her. Getting closer every time. A heavy silence fell between them. Edward looked up. His gaze was no longer sharp, but filled with something close to desperation. You don't understand what this means to me. Things aren't the same for us. When a bond like this forms, it consumes. It transforms. If you were like me, maybe you'd understand. He said it quietly, but there was more behind his words. Not just resignation. A hint. A veiled threat. As if the idea of Nate becoming, like him, wasn't so impossible. But Nate didn't flinch. He smiled. A dry, sharp smile. If I were a vampire, you and I wouldn't be having this conversation, he said firmly. No raised voice. Because I wouldn't waste time warning you. Edward's eyes widened slightly. And for a brief second, a tiny one, fear crossed his face. Nate stepped forward, tension now evident in his stance. But I'm not. And that's why I'm talking to you now. Because I still believe you can make the right choice. Edward saw nothing. His lips were tight, shoulders tense as if each of Nate's words struck a part of him he preferred to keep buried. The wind picked up, stirring the leaves. The trees groaned softly. Finally, Edward spoke, a voice lower than Nate expected. She's everything to me. I don't know if I can walk away. Nate looked at him in silence, then sighed and added. This was my final warning. In the end, the choice is yours, but I hope you don't regret it. Because as of today, you've lost that right. The two stared at each other. Two completely different figures, facing off beneath the gray forest light. And although Edward was the immortal, the predator, he was the one who looked away first. Nate said nothing more. He turned and walked away, leaving Edward alone among the trees. Because deep down, he knew, the real danger wasn't just what Edward might do, but what Nate was willing to do if he failed. Author's notes. An extra chapter because I don't know if I'll upload it tonight or tomorrow. I'm in exam week and I'm a bit busy. If I see Power Stone then I'll get ahead more. Creation is hard, cheer me up. Jayjayempi creators thoughts. 38 comments 0 vote. Chapter 49. If you want to support to continue with the chapters and improve the quality of the language, or read some advanced chapters +8, this week I will upload several chapters to Patreon. Please follow me on patreon.com/jjmp. The way back home was silent. Nate didn't turn on the radio. He wasn't in the mood for music or noise. The silence felt more comfortable than any melody trying to soothe what he felt, a thick, uncomfortable conflict pressing on his chest. He had argued with Edward. He had said things that, in his head, still seemed right. But there was something in the vampire's eyes, in the desperate tone that slipped into his words, that stirred something deeper than simple disdain. It wasn't full empathy. It wasn't forgiveness. It was more like the bitter awareness of watching someone who had already crossed a point of no return. He parked in front of his house. The engine stopped with a soft purr, as if the car, too, needed to rest. Nate leaned his forehead against the steering wheel for a few seconds. He closed his eyes, took a deep breath. Then, I got out. From the living room window, a warm light filtered through the curtains. It was one of those domestic scenes that, at another point in his life, would have seemed mundane. Now he valued them as anchors. Inside, his grandmother was sitting on the floor, legs crossed, moving a string with a feather at the end. Her old cat lazily batted at it in the air, more out of habit than genuine interest. When she saw him come in, the woman looked up and smiled. Look who's back early for a change. I thought, being Sunday, you wouldn't be back until dusk. Nate gave a small smile, forced, almost mechanical. I just had to take care of a few things quickly. His grandmother stood up with surprising agility for her age, brushed off her hands, and walked toward him with the calm of someone who owes no hurry to anyone. You've been tense these past few days, she said, watching him with those bright eyes that never seemed to age. Quieter than usual. And that's saying something, considering you're already an expert at staying quiet. Nate let out a brief sigh. He was exhausted. Emotionally. He had been holding so much inside, carrying it as if it were his sole responsibility. But this time, he needed another voice. An external one. Someone who wouldn't try to push or stop him, just listen. Can I ask you something? He murmured. You already did, sweetheart, she replied with a smile, gesturing for him to follow her. They walked to the kitchen in silence. His grandmother started making tea. While the water boiled, Nate ran a hand through his hair, searching for the right way to untangle the knot inside him. He rested his elbows on the table and spoke. Let's say someone close to you is getting involved in something complicated. Not necessarily bad, but risky. Something that could hurt them, maybe even worse. The woman watched him over the rim of her cup, not interrupting. And you know you could stop it. You could step in and pull them out before it's too late, he continued. But, doing that would mean deciding for them. Taking control of their life. And you don't know if that's the right thing. You just know you want to protect them. His grandmother nodded slowly. It was clear she weighed each word as if it carried more weight than it seemed. And does this person want to be there? In that risky situation? Nate lowered his gaze. I don't know. I think so. They're intrigued. Maybe even, drawn to it. But they don't have the full picture, they don't see the risks the way I do. His grandmother watched him for a few seconds before speaking. You're a smart boy, Nathaniel. If it were really as dangerous as you say, you wouldn't even be asking me. The fact that you have doubts means there's something good in that dangerous environment. Nate thought for a few seconds. He knew the Cullens weren't as bad as he'd thought at first. Yes, they were dangerous, but any human had the potential to be, too, right? Shouldn't Bella be the one to decide if she wanted to take that risk or not? His grandmother looked at him in silence, set the cup down on the table, and gently spun it between her fingers. Then, as if seeing the turmoil inside him, she spoke. When you were a child and learning to ride a bike, do you remember how hard it was for your parents not to hold onto you the whole time? Nate looked up, confused. They wanted to protect you. They wanted to keep you from falling, from scraping your knees. But if they hadn't let go, you never would have learned. And yes, you fell. You got hurt. You cried. But you also got back up. And that was the important part. Nate stayed silent. He listened to her like someone hearing a story that, though familiar, made real sense for the first time. Everyone deserves the freedom to make mistakes, she went on. Even if it means they'll suffer. It's not about leaving them alone, but being close in case they need us. Sometimes, protecting someone doesn't mean preventing the pain, it means being there when they face it. He lowered his gaze again. Her words weighed heavier because they were true. Because deep down, what was eating him up wasn't just the fear for Bella, it was the helplessness of not being able to save her, his way of not being able to control the board. And what if the damage is irreversible? He asked, almost in a whisper. Isn't it better to prevent it? His grandmother looked at him with tenderness, without judgment. Of course. But tell me, who decides what's irreversible? You. Me. What if what we think is a wound, is, for them, part of their growth? Silence. Loving someone, whether family, friend or something more, doesn't give us the right to live their life for them. It only gives us the duty to be present. Nate nodded, very slowly. The truth in her words struck deep. He didn't need to name anyone. There was no need. She understood. She always understood. And that shared silence, that unspoken complicity, was wiser than any explicit confession. Thank you, he murmured at last. It's the duty of incredibly smart people to guide others, sweetheart, she replied with a soft smile and a wink. Now go get some sleep, darling. You're back in school tomorrow and have lots of people to punch. Nate laughed, for the first time in hours. A light, sincere laugh. He stood, leaned over, and kissed her on the head before going upstairs. That night, as he lay in bed, he thought of Bella. Of Edward. Of Alice. And for the first time, he didn't feel rage or urgency, but an uncomfortable, honest acceptance. He couldn't control other people's paths. Bella would have to make her own decision. When she had all the information, if she decided she wanted to walk away, Nate would help her leave them behind. If she decided she wanted to stay, then he would do everything in his power to keep her safe. Creation is hard, cheer me up. Jayjayempi Creators Thoughts. 15 comments 0 vote. Chapter 50. If you want to support to continue with the chapters and improve the quality of the language, or read some advanced chapters +8, this week I will upload several chapters to Patreon. Please follow me on patreon.com/jjmp. Chapter sponsored by Zarenblack. P.S. I hope your grandma gets better soon. Monday morning in Forks had dawned gray, with that ever-present drizzle that never seemed to stop entirely. The raindrops tapped monotonously against the windshield of Nate's car as he drove to school, his brow slightly furrowed, his thoughts scattered. He had made an important decision. He wouldn't intervene anymore. Not while Bella remained unaware of the truth. But that choice had left him in an uncomfortable place, almost foreign to himself. He had always been someone who acted, who anticipated, who would jump into the fire if needed. Waiting wasn't natural. His grandmother had given him sensible advice, but following it felt like walking with his shoes on the wrong feet. The rumors about his suspension had died down as quickly as they'd started. Gossip, if not fed, dies on its own. Returning to class felt almost normal. Almost. In the first period, Eric greeted him with a genuine smile. Hey, Nate. Good to have you back. Nate studied him for a second. There was something different in his expression. Pity, maybe. Everything okay? Nate asked, not bothering to hide his tone. Eric shrugged. Yeah, of course. I just figured you'd be kind of upset. People say Bella's dating Edward Cullen. Nate tilted his head, as if only half interested. Oh yeah, is it official now? Eric was quick to clarify. Well, they eat together. And you know how people are. Nate just shrugged. It wasn't his business. Not yet. He'd only act when the truth came to light, and if Bella chose not to see it. Classes passed without major incidents, until government. Edward was already in the classroom. Their eyes met for a second. Nate kept his mind blank, an ability he'd been refining daily. Edward watched him, tense but finally nodded with a cool formality. Nate returned the gesture without adding anything. They ended up sitting on opposite sides of the room. When the lunch bell rang, Nate was heading toward his usual table with Eric, but Bella intercepted him in the hallway. She looked genuinely happy to see him. Nate, want to eat with us? She asked. With Edward and me, I mean. He offered a faint smile, without enthusiasm. Thanks, but I already told Eric I'd sit with him. Bella pressed her lips together, a little disappointed. Sure, I get it. At the table, after the obligatory greetings and some idle chatter, Jessica leaned in as soon as she saw Nate sit down. We're going to La Push this weekend. You coming? She played with a hot pink fingernail and winked. It was obvious. With Bella now focused on Edward, Nate seemed like fair game. He didn't answer immediately. His eyes, as usual, drifted toward the Cullens' table. Edward and Bella were eating together, detached from everything else. But his attention shifted to Alice. She looked at him too, and gave him a slight nod. Jasper, sitting beside her, stared at Nate with a discomfort that felt almost physical. Nate noticed how Jasper slid his chair a little closer to Alice. She didn't seem to notice. She looked dim, distant. Like her mind was elsewhere. Since that night in the car, she hadn't sent a single message. Despite being the one who had asked to keep in touch. Part of him was grateful. Everything about that night had unraveled him. He'd never had a conversation like that before, one where he was completely open. A sharp sound pulled him back. Come on, say yes, Jessica pressed, her smile widening. It'll be fun. Nate didn't avoid the flirting. He didn't return it with excitement either, but he didn't brush it off. Maybe it was time to interact more with humans. To distance himself, just a little, from secrets and vampires. Sounds good, he finally said. I might go. From across the table, Eric looked at him with a hint of concern. Mike's going too, you know. It sounded like a warning. Everyone remembered the punch. Nate simply raised an eyebrow. It's fine. As long as he doesn't have a problem with me, I won't have one with him. Jessica laughed. I doubt he will. Not if he wants to make it to prom without a black eye. She brazenly slid her arm against Nate's. Nate smiled but didn't say anything else. I could invite Bella, he added casually. He knew exactly what he was doing. Edward couldn't set foot in La Push because of the treaty. Maybe there, on neutral ground, Bella would start to see what she refused to acknowledge. And if Jacob happened to be around, well, it never hurt to have an alternative closer to the truth. English class came, and Nate was the first to enter. He took his usual seat. Alice walked in a few minutes later. She saw him instantly, but didn't approach. She hesitated, just slightly. Then sat far away. Nate lowered his gaze. That silent rejection stung more than he expected. When the bell rang, Alice was the first to leave. She didn't look back. He frowned but said nothing. Let it go, he told himself, even though inside, the impulse to reach for her clawed at him. In the gym, as usual, he sat with Bella on the bleachers, their refuge while watching everyone else run around the court. How are things with Edward? Nate asked, tone neutral. Bella looked down, a little flushed. They're good. He's attentive, really sweet, and kind of mysterious. But there was a crack in her voice. A flicker of doubt. You still think about the van, don't you? Bella looked at him, surprised. I do. I can't help it. It doesn't make sense. No one talks about it, but I know something's off. Nate nodded slowly. Maybe you need some space. We're going to La Push this weekend. Why don't you come? We could invite Jake too. Bella hesitated a moment, then nodded. Would it be okay if I invited Edward? Nate smiled, no trace of irony. Sure. If he wants to come, he's welcome. He couldn't tell her the truth. But he could nudge her gently toward it. 14 comments 0 vote. Chapter 51. If you want to support to continue with the chapters and improve the quality of the language, or read some advanced chapters, this week I will upload several chapters to Patreon. Please follow me on patreon.com/Jayjayempi. The week passed without any major developments, at least, on the surface. Nate kept his distance, watching from the sidelines as Edward and Bella wove, thread by thread, a relationship that felt inevitable. There was something in the way Bella looked at him, in how she smiled even when he said nothing, that made it obvious she was falling. Fast. Hard. Maybe past the point of no return. But then there were the questions. The doubts. Nate recognized them. He knew that, sooner or later, Bella would find out the truth. Or Edward would tell her. Either way, the road led to the same destination. And a part of him, a bigger part than he was willing to admit, was hoping it would happen soon. As for Alice, well, Alice had vanished from his radar. Not literally, of course. He still saw her in the hallways, in class, and sometimes in the cafeteria sitting with her family. But their eyes never met. They didn't speak. It was as if that moment in the car, that almost kiss, that fleeting connection, had been a mistake neither of them wanted to acknowledge. Or maybe it wasn't a mistake. Maybe it was a message. And for once, he had decided to listen. Nate took it as a sign to stay away from the supernatural world. He thought that if he didn't look at it, didn't seek it, didn't provoke it, then maybe it wouldn't keep approaching him. Maybe that was the deal. An unspoken one. Unwritten. Undeclared. But he wasn't even sure that deal truly existed. Worse yet, he had a persistent, uncomfortable suspicion that even when Bella found out the truth, when she knew what Edward was, she wouldn't walk away. She wouldn't be afraid. She wouldn't leave. Pushing those thoughts aside, Nate continued with his normal routine. With one reluctant exception, he began spending more time with Jessica. Not because he was genuinely interested, but because he felt he had to try. He wanted to see if he could feel something for a normal girl. If he could go back to belonging in a world where people didn't stop vans with their hands, didn't have visions, didn't run faster than cars. But the more time he spent with Jessica, the more he caught himself checking the time. Her forced laughs exhausted him. Her jokes about the Cullens felt silly, though part of him found comfort in the mundane nature of her ignorance. Saturday arrived. They had planned a trip to La Push. Bella would drive her truck. Eric, Angela, and the others would ride with Mike. And somehow, Nate still wasn't sure how he'd agreed to pick up Jessica. They were driving down the highway when she, thrilled by Nate's unexpected attention, leaned into his shoulder with an exaggerated smile. Weirdly, you agreed to come with me, she said with a nervous giggle. Honestly, I thought you didn't even like me. Nate barely smiled. His fingers tapped quietly on the steering wheel. I thought it might be a good idea to make more friends. Friends, she repeated, tilting her head like she didn't quite understand the word. Is that all you think of me? He glanced at her. He liked direct people, but this was just awkward. He didn't answer right away. I don't know, Jessica, he finally said. I just thought it'd be nice to get out for a bit, distract myself. Well, I'm okay with that, she replied, scooting closer. Because honestly, I always thought you were really cute. You must have broken a lot of hearts back in your old town, right? Nate gave a short, hollow laugh. If Bella were there, she'd know instantly it was fake. Not at all, but thanks for the compliment. Jessica didn't let up. She watched him like every gesture was fascinating. You're mysterious, you know. Always so quiet, like you're hiding something. I like that, she winked. Though I bet there's someone you like already, isn't there? Nate swallowed and kept his eyes on the road. For a moment, his mind drifted elsewhere. He remembered how, just once, he'd felt truly seen. Then he looked at Jessica, and everything felt loud. Shallow. I'm not looking for anything right now, he said, not putting much weight into it. Nothing. She repeated, surprised, like he was speaking another language. Wow, didn't expect that. I thought you were dating Bella before she got all weird with Edward. Nate frowned slightly. Bella and I are just friends. Uzu, Jessica murmured, unconvinced. Then she laughed it off. Well, better for me, right? He forced a smile and turned on the radio to fill the growing silence. Pop music filled the car, light and empty. Jessica hummed along, while Nate silently wished the drive would end as quickly as possible. He glanced at her again. Jessica was a pretty girl, sure. But she didn't reach him. The more time he spent with her, the more he noticed her imperfections. Worse, the more he noticed himself pretending. Jessica was interested in him, yes. But not in the real him. She liked the image, the quiet, handsome guy. She didn't listen to what he said. She didn't see him. And that, for Nate, was heavy. He looked back at the road, focusing on the trees swaying along the roadside. He gripped the steering wheel as if it could anchor him to something real. He didn't know how much longer he could keep faking it. Thankfully, the drive didn't last as long as it felt. The ocean breeze carried salt into the parking lot, where the group was already stepping out of their cars. The sky remained overcast, and the air had that wet chill typical of La Push. Jessica was the first out. She immediately ran to Angela, greeting her with exaggerated enthusiasm. Nate shut off the engine and leaned back for a moment, eyes closed, before opening the door. In the distance, he heard laughter. The carefree murmur of teenagers on a day off. Everything seemed normal. Mike got out of his car next. His eyes briefly met Nate's. Just a glance, but enough to feel it, tension. Mike said nothing, but the discomfort was almost tangible. Nate simply nodded politely and closed his door. Then Bella appeared beside him, approaching silently. She leaned in and whispered. I thought you were into Alice. And now you're with Jessica. You're more complicated than I thought. Nate smiled, tilting his head as if the comment didn't faze him. But inside, something clenched in his chest. I think you're reading too much into things, he said calmly, not looking at her. Before Bella could respond, Nate glanced away. He had spotted something. In the distance, near the picnic tables, Jake was walking toward them with two guys. I invited Jacob, Nate explained, half to himself, half to the others who were starting to watch with curiosity. Jacob raised a hand in greeting, cheerful, as if he were genuinely happy to see them. Bella. Nate. He called out, hurrying over. Beside him walked two taller, broader boys. One had a neutral, almost stern expression. The other looked like he struggled to stay calm. There was something wild in the way he scanned the group. Jake arrived first, grinning brightly. These are my friends, Sam and Paul. Nice to meet you, Sam said, stepping forward and shaking Nate's hand. The handshake was firm. The gaze is direct. Almost too much. You're just like Billy described you, Sam added. Nate stared a second too long. Did Billy talk about him to others? Why? It felt strange, but he brushed it off. Or at least, filed it away for later. Bella also greeted them, her smile tight. Her discomfort with anything unknown still showed. Paul nodded in return, barely. Then, unable to resist, Jessica reappeared. She grabbed Bella's arm with false familiarity, eyeing the newcomers curiously. Don't take it personally, she said loudly, without a filter. Bella's just upset her boyfriend, the mysterious Cullen, didn't want to come. Sam barely turned his head to look at her. His voice was low but clear. The Cullens can't come here. With that, he walked off toward the group already settling near the picnic area. Paul followed, after a glance at Nate. Bella frowned. What did he mean by that? She murmured, but no one answered. Nate already knew what was coming. He watched as Bella moved away from Jessica and walked toward Jacob, drawn by curiosity like it was a current she couldn't resist. He stood there a moment longer, feeling the sand crunch under his shoes. He looked out at the ocean, wishing he were anywhere else. Jessica returned to his side, oblivious to the emotional storm brewing around them. So, are we gonna walk on the beach, or what? Nate smiled, without much warmth. Sure, he said. Let's go. He gave one last glance at Bella, now seated next to Jacob. They started walking in silence, tracing the coastline. The waves crashed softly against the black stones, and the mist from the sea clung lightly to their clothes. Jessica chattered endlessly, waving her hands, unaware that Nate was barely nodding. And then Angela said Eric might ask her to the dance. Can you believe it? She acted all surprised, but I knew she was secretly hoping for it. Sometimes people are way more predictable than they think. Nate muttered a vague, without stopping. His eyes wandered toward the horizon, tracing the gray line where the sea met the sky. The wind stung his face, and he wasn't sure if it was the salt or his frustration burning his eyes. Jessica kept talking, not noticing her words were bouncing off an ever-thickening mental wall. Nate walked beside her, but he wasn't there. His mind was somewhere far, far away. All of this is a waste of time, he thought. I'm pretending something can happen here, but I can't force interest that isn't real. He remembered that night in the car. The shared silence with Alice. The intensity of her gaze. That electric feeling he still couldn't fully explain. Was it real? Or just the result of her vampiric allure? Maybe that was it, he thought. Maybe I got dazzled. He wondered if talking to Alice again would make that feeling vanish, or if it would just stir it up even more. Maybe it was better to face her again, understand her, and figure out what had gotten under his skin. Jessica laughed at something she'd said, and Nate barely registered it. He glanced at her. She seemed satisfied, convinced things were going well. She even took his arm lightly, leaning a little closer than necessary. I think you and I would make a good couple, she said with a shy, flirty smile. You're different, you know. Mysterious. But not in the dumb, dramatic way Edward is. With you, it feels real. Nate didn't respond. He stopped to look at the sea, and then, Jessica stepped forward. She rose on her tiptoes and, without warning, leaned in to kiss him. Her hand brushed his chest. Her lips reached for his. Nate stepped back, not harshly, but firmly enough. No, he said quietly. Jessica, I'm not interested in you like that. Jessica blinked. Her smile slowly faded, replaced by a mix of disappointment and offense. Excuse me. Then what's all this been? You've been sending mixed signals all day. Nate lowered his eyes for a moment. She was right. He had been unclear. He'd let things drag on, and even if he had his reasons, it wasn't fair to her. You're right, he admitted. I'm sorry. I shouldn't have made you think otherwise. That was my mistake. She didn't reply. She crossed her arms, clearly annoyed, and turned her head away. Nate sighed. He turned around and walked back toward the rest of the group, gathered near the tables. In the distance, he spotted Bella with Jacob, leaning toward each other. Bella's body language was strange. She looked him in the eyes while laughing a little too loudly, twirling her hair. It looked like a clumsy attempt at flirting. Nate just raised an eyebrow. Apparently, today was the day for mixed signals. Creation is hard, cheer me up. Jayjayempi creators' thoughts. 13 comments 0 vote. Chapter 52. If you want to support to continue with the chapters and improve the quality of the language, or read some advanced chapters, this week I will upload several chapters to Patreon. Please follow me on patreon.com/jjmp. The salty breeze carried the murmur of the waves as Nate and Jessica silently made their way back to the circle that was beginning to form around the spot where the bonfire would soon be lit. She walked a few steps behind, arms crossed, her gaze lost in the damp sand. Nate's rejection still hung between them like a thick fog that neither dared to dissipate with words. Nate, for his part, kept his eyes fixed ahead. His expression was unreadable, but his mind kept spinning. He watched attentively as Bella and Jacob talked near the shore, somewhat apart from the rest. The scene held a tension that was hard to ignore. Bella laughed. But it wasn't her usual laugh, not the genuine one he had heard in gym class or the school parking lot, but a sharper, forced version, as if she were acting out a scene she didn't fully believe in. She leaned toward Jacob, her fingers playing with a lock of her hair as she listened to him speak. Nate narrowed his eyes. On the surface, it seemed like flirting, but there was something else. A hint of tense curiosity, as if Bella was trying to get Jacob to talk rather than build intimacy. Jacob, for his part, looked delighted with the attention, puffing out his chest a bit more with each sentence. This was not a casual conversation. Bella was searching for something, and she was probably finding it. He was about to quietly move closer to listen more when a voice called to him from the opposite side. Hey, can we talk for a moment? Mike said cautiously, stopping near him, shoulders slightly hunched. Nate blinked as if coming out of a deep analytical state. He turned to Mike and noticed in his eyes a mix of insecurity and determination. He briefly glanced at Jessica, who had now taken a seat next to Sam in a clumsy attempt to seem indifferent. He nodded. Sure. They walked a few meters toward the tree line, away from the sea. Nate kept a neutral face, still interested in the strange attitude Bella had shown. Mike stopped, hands in his pockets. He took a few seconds to find the words. Look, I wanted to apologize. About what happened at school. Nate watched him closely. Mike didn't seem to be lying. His gestures didn't show wounded pride, just human awkwardness. At the time, I was interested in Bella. I don't know what came over me. But I think it was fair that you put me in my place. I acted like an idiot. Nate tilted his head slightly. It was the first time he saw Mike with that kind of sincere vulnerability. No hostility was detected, only regret. No problem, he answered calmly. I went too far too. Mike let out a nervous laugh. Yeah, well, I never thought you'd hit that hard. Left me with a sore face for days. A small smile briefly crossed Nate's lips. I just got lucky. The silence that followed was less awkward than before. There seemed to be an unspoken truce between them. I feel like an idiot for wanting to ask Bella to the dance when I barely knew her, Mike murmured after a while. Nate shrugged. You're not the only one. Bella has that effect on the people of Forks. But, to be honest, I think you'd make a better pair with Jessica, he said casually as if testing the waters. Mike looked at him, surprised. Really? I thought you and her were a thing. Nate slowly shook his head. I'm not interested in that. And I think Jessica was only interested because I was the new guy. Mike chuckled softly, almost as if he related to her. You're nicer than you seem, you know. Maybe, I'll ask her when they light the bonfire. They walked back. Approaching the group, Nate searched for Bella with his eyes. She was now with Angela, but her face was tense as if trying to solve something in her head. Jake, meanwhile, stood near the area where they were going to light the fire, wearing a triumphant expression. Nate approached him quietly, hands in his pockets. What's up, Jake? Something good happened. He asked in a low voice but loaded with intent. Jacob smiled like someone holding a secret that burned his tongue. You have no idea, brother. I followed your advice, and talked to her normally. Told her things about the tribe. About our legends. She liked it. Seemed very interested. Just that. Nate asked, amused by the normalcy Jacob claimed he kept in the conversation. Jacob hesitated a second. Well, we also talked about the Cullens. The name struck inside Nate like a dull bell, but his face betrayed nothing. And what exactly did you say? Jacob shrugged. Just what my dad says. You know, those old superstitious stories he tells in a serious tone. Nate nodded slowly. The confirmation he needed. When they finally lit the bonfire, everyone gathered in a semicircle around the flames. Sparks flew into the sky like fleeting fireflies. Laughter, stories, and songs began to fill the air with a lighter energy. Bella approached Nate without warning and sat next to him. She said nothing at first. She just looked at the fire, her eyes shining with reflection. I have a crazy theory, she murmured suddenly. And I'll feel really stupid if it turns out to be false. Nate barely turned toward her, elbows on his knees. What kind of theory? I don't want to say it yet, she replied, with a serious expression. Honestly, the more I think about it, the more absurd it seems, but I think it's the most solid thing I have. Nate held her gaze for a second. The pieces had been there for Bella, and he was glad she didn't take long to put them together. Now he was sure. Edward's secret had its days numbered. 6 comments 0 vote. Chapter 53. If you want to support to continue with the chapters and improve the quality of the language, or read some advanced chapters, this week I will upload several chapters to Patreon. Please follow me on patreon.com/Jayjayempi. The day at La Push ended surprisingly well. After their conversation, Mike, feeling braver than usual, gathered the courage to ask Jessica to the prom. She hesitated for only a second, as if she needed to remember whether she was still upset, and then accepted with an enchanted smile. Nate was struck by how quickly Jessica's mood shifted, as though she had an internal switch aligning her to whatever served her best. He didn't judge her for it, but it did feel a bit peculiar. The drive home, alone in his car, was the best part. The silence let him think clearly, and he promised himself he would never get involved in something like that again. Never. While driving, Bella's face drifted into his mind. The stories Jacob had shared were more than enough for her to form a theory alarmingly close to the truth. He knew her mind well, she wouldn't let it go. And if Nate knew her as well as he thought, she wouldn't wait a single day before confronting Edward. That night he went to sleep expecting change. It was inevitable. The next morning began like any other in Forks. Overcast skies, steady drizzle, and sleepy students moving through halls with soaked backpacks. Nate entered his first class, took his usual seat, and didn't have to wait long before Eric slid into the desk next to him, visibly enthusiastic. Hey, he whispered with a triumphant grin. Remember yesterday? You know, Mike and Jessica. Yeah, Nate replied with little interest. Well, that encouraged me. So this morning I asked Angela. Nate looked at him, surprised this time. And she said yes, Eric answered with a brief, nervous laugh. Nate nodded, crossing his arms. Angela's nice. Good choice. Eric seemed to puff up with pride. Yeah, that's what I thought. I don't know why I didn't think of it before. Nate stayed silent, gazing out the window as class began. The rain fell in that hypnotic rhythm that seemed to seep into the city's bones. Second and third periods passed without incident, homework, lectures, yawning students, teachers on autopilot. No one seemed to notice the undercurrent of tension, anticipation. For Nate it was the calm before something important. It changed in the fourth period, government. Nate sat down at his usual desk and, shortly after, Edward Cullen entered the room. Since their conversation in the woods, they had come to an unspoken agreement to avoid one another, as though they'd decided not to exist in each other's presence. Nate, having promised to wait until Bella discovered the truth, spent that class staring out the window. And Edward, who had grown self-conscious about talking to Nate, perhaps because someone for the first time had looked at him with unsettling clarity, was content to sit on the opposite side of the classroom. But that morning, against all expectations, Edward, still showing reluctance in his expression, moved to the seat next to Nate. It wasn't accidental. Space wasn't limited. The room was half empty. It was a choice. Nate barely turned his face. He studied him briefly. Edward's posture was tight, his knuckles slightly white on the desk. Are you sure you want this? Nate murmured in a voice so low it barely rose above the tapping of rain against the windows. Edward didn't answer immediately. He looked like he was weighing whether to talk or get up again. Finally, he said, I wouldn't sit next to you if it wasn't important. Nate turned his head slightly, still not looking at him directly. He didn't respond. He just dropped his gaze to the desk, irritated by the interruption, waiting for something to start. Edward swallowed. His voice dropped lower. This morning, I ran into Bella in the parking lot. Nate raised an eyebrow, silent. She said she wanted to talk to me. That it was important. She didn't elaborate, but I saw it in her eyes. Nate released a dismissive sigh. And what does that have to do with me? I just want to know. Edward hesitated. His gaze hardened slightly, more anxiety than annoyance. Did you tell her anything? Nate slowly turned to face him, expression cold, restrained. No. A dry, precise word. He wasn't going to do him the favor of prolonging the answer. Edward seemed to relax just a little, but his hands remained tense on his knees. Nate noticed. He also noted the brittleness Edward tried to hide behind a calm facade. I swear, Nate, I'm not here to blame you. I just need to know how much she knows. I can't read her mind, and I don't know how to approach this. You're the one closest to her, you must have some idea. That doesn't mean I owe you any answers. Nate turned to face forward, firm. Edward drew a deep breath. I don't want you to think I'm pressuring you. I just don't know how to tell her the truth. I'm not ready. Not yet. Nate frowned slightly in disgust. You knew it was only a matter of time. Edward lowered his gaze. Maybe you're right. I didn't want this to happen. But what's done is done. I can't undo how I feel. And she deserves to know. Just not today. Nate clenched his jaw. A silent rage welled up inside him. Maybe it was because Edward had so many chances to do the right thing, and still chose the coward's route. She already has a pretty solid idea, you know. You can't avoid this forever. Edward nodded, resigned. It had to come eventually, he murmured. We've been talking a lot, and maybe I dropped hints. I just didn't expect her to pick up on them this fast. As though Nate's silence was all the permission he needed, he spoke quickly, voice nearly pleading, mostly to himself, not Nate. Just one day. One more day. To figure out how to tell her. As if that would change anything, Nate muttered, eyes fixed on the front. Edward nodded again, resigned and sad. I know. Thank you, for not telling her. Nate remained silent, and didn't look at him. He stayed seated, immobile, his back straight, expression taut. Edward understood. He rose silently and returned to his place on the opposite side, his steps slower than usual. Nate watched him for only a few seconds before letting out a low sigh. 12 comments 0 vote. Chapter 54. If you want to support to continue with the chapters and improve the quality of the language, or read some advanced chapters, this week I will upload several chapters to Patreon. Please follow me on patreon.com/Jayjayempi. Government class had ended, and Nate walked out of the classroom with calm steps, while Edward sped off toward the parking lot. The conversation still irritated him a little. That sudden concern for Bella, those almost desperate questions, did he really expect help? When he arrived at the cafeteria, the usual lunchtime murmur surrounded him. He scanned the tables until he spotted Bella, sitting with Angela and Jessica. Apparently, the boys had decided to eat elsewhere for a change, while the girls chatted with animated gestures and bright expressions. Nate paused for a second before approaching. He was surprised, almost unsettled, to see that Jessica didn't seem even remotely upset with him. After the way he had rejected her at La Push, he had expected at least a cutting glance or a passive-aggressive comment. But there she was, acting like nothing had happened. I guess I'll have to thank Mike later, he thought with a hint of relief as he approached with his tray. He sat beside Bella, who barely turned her head to look at him, her brow slightly furrowed. What are you talking about? Nate asked casually. Jessica, smiling as if it were the most exciting topic in the world, answered. We were planning a mini-emergency mission. What kind of mission? Nate asked, picking up his fork without much interest. Dresses, she said excitedly. Now that we all have dates and nothing to wear, we thought we'd go to Port Angeles this afternoon. The three of us. Angela nodded silently. Bella, however, looked distant, as if her mind was still somewhere else. Yeah, it's a good idea, she said at last, lowering her gaze. I still don't have mine. Nate raised an eyebrow, wondering if Edward had asked her out during the week he'd been suspended. Angela, curious but not malicious, asked. Are you going with Edward? Bella looked up, as if just realizing Nate was there, then smiled with a mix of apology and firmness. I'd already agreed to go with Nate, she said. I'm sure Edward will understand. Nate held her gaze a second longer than necessary, offering a faint smile, somewhat surprised. He had assumed Bella wouldn't go with him anymore. Since her relationship with Edward had progressed, he had taken it for granted that she'd cancel at any moment. Jessica turned to Nate with sudden interest. So you'll have to find something to wear too, huh? I guess so, Nate murmured. Nothing a jacket and tie can't fix. While the girls resumed their talk about stores, styles, and colors, a symphony in which Nate was just an accidental spectator, Bella leaned toward him and lowered her voice. Have you heard anything about Edward? Nate held back a sigh. He didn't owe Edward any favors, but he also didn't want to say anything that might worry Bella. He looked kind of sick, he replied indifferently. That was it. Nothing more. She frowned a bit more but didn't press. The bell rang, cutting off half-finished conversations and pushing everyone out of the cafeteria. Nate picked up his tray and walked toward his next class. English was next. Nate arrived early, as usual, and took a seat near the window. Outside, the drizzle continued falling with the same monotony that blanketed all of Forks, tapping faintly against the glass as if even the weather was stuck in an endless routine. As soon as he stepped into the classroom, his eyes searched, almost instinctively, for Alice. He didn't see her at first, but that didn't surprise him. Over the past week, she'd been carefully avoiding him. Arriving late, leaving early, sitting on the opposite side of the room. Nate had noticed, of course. He'd let it go at first, thinking it was for the best, but now he wasn't so sure. There was a question he couldn't shake, and it all revolved around that night in the car. He was convinced what he felt hadn't been normal. Part of him, the rational one that always tried to find logic in things, kept repeating that it had only been the effect of her dazzle. He knew vampires gave off a kind of aura that could cloud your senses if you weren't prepared. It had taken him time to get used to Alice's presence without feeling dazed. But that night in the car, they'd been very close, for too long. What if that was all it was? Or was there something more? The door opened. Alice entered the classroom with smooth, precise movements. Their eyes met for a second. She looked at him, then quickly looked away, almost nervously, and walked to the far end of the room. She sat down without hesitation, not looking at anyone. Nate followed her with his eyes. He felt a quiet but insistent pull. He wasn't going to let it go this time. A guy walked in shortly after. Nate didn't recognize him, probably a classmate he had never bothered to remember. The guy saw the empty seat next to Alice and took it without a second thought, pulling out his book with disinterest and diving into it. Alice didn't react. She kept staring forward, her body so still it was almost like she was pretending not to notice. Nate stood up. He crossed the room with calm but determined steps. He stopped next to the guy and tapped him on the shoulder. What do you want? The boy muttered without looking up, clearly annoyed by the interruption. When he looked up, his eyes scanned Nate from head to toe. The annoyance on his face vanished almost instantly, replaced by a mix of surprise and maybe a bit of nervousness. Do you need something? He asked, voice softer now. Would you mind switching seats with me? Nate said bluntly. The guy didn't even hesitate. He quietly gathered his things and moved seats with almost comical speed. Nate sat next to Alice. She turned her head toward him, surprised. She opened her mouth as if to say something, but no words came out. Her expression was hard to read. Confusion, maybe even discomfort, or both. Like she hadn't expected him to do that. Like she didn't know how to react. Hi, said Nate, relaxed, with a subtle smile. Feels like it's been a while since we talked. Alice gave a short, soft laugh, though it wasn't entirely comfortable. Sorry, I've been a little distracted lately. Nate leaned back in his chair, keeping his tone light. What's got you so distracted? He asked, still looking forward. Alice hesitated for a second. Things at home have been tense. Because of Edward and Bella. It was a partial truth. Nate knew that instantly, from the way she avoided his gaze when she said it. I get it, he replied, without accusing. It's strange, right? Being so invested in what other people are doing. Especially when there's not much you can do about it. Alice smiled, at last, her expression softening. Yeah, it is, but I want to believe everything will work out for them. My brother, I think he deserves to be happy. And then she realized. She had said it to Nate. The sweetness of her smile vanished in an instant. Her eyes widened slightly, a quiet pang of discomfort showing. Nate didn't correct her. He only tilted his head slightly, his expression not judgmental, but skeptical. Either way, he said calmly, it won't be long before Bella finds out. Alice nodded slowly. Yeah, I think so too. And Edward knows it. He's really nervous about that. So much so that he asked me to talk to you yesterday. Nate raised an eyebrow, turning slightly toward her. To me. Yeah, she said quietly. He wanted to know if you knew anything. If Bella had already talked to you. Nate chuckled under his breath, a mix of irony and resignation. Guess his anxiety got the better of him because he asked me the same thing today. But when I gave him my answer, he left. Chose to put off talking to Bella. Alice looked down, her expression almost melancholic. I understand. That's a scary conversation. Knowing that when you finally tell the truth, everything might change. Nate watched her for a second longer, then spoke gently. It would have been easier if you'd asked me yourself. A message, for example. She looked at him again and smiled, a little embarrassed. To be honest, I didn't know how to start that conversation with you. I know you're not exactly a fan of that relationship. That's when he understood. The subtext. He stayed quiet for a few seconds, his face shifting into an expression of delayed realization. Well, I can't blame you for not trying to contact me, Nate said, leaning back again with a relaxed gesture. Judging by the way that guy reacted, I probably have a reputation for being dangerous. Alice laughed softly, musical. She knew exactly what Nate was trying to do, break the tension. To be fair, if you smiled more, you'd look less threatening, she said with a smirk. Is that fashion advice, or do I look violent? Nate asked, tilting his head with a barely there grin. Both, Alice replied playfully. Everyone probably thinks you're going to punch someone, like that guy in the cafeteria. Mike, Nate muttered with a resigned sigh. The good thing about that reputation is that I probably won't get many invites to the dance. Alice laughed again, this time more genuinely. The atmosphere between them began to feel different. More comfortable. Lighter. After a brief pause, she looked at him again, this time with sincere curiosity. I thought it was sweet of you to take Bella to the dance. He frowned slightly, surprised. And how do you know that? Alice raised an eyebrow, as if the answer were obvious, then glanced around to make sure no one was listening. Remember the enhanced senses thing? She said in a conspiratorial tone. I overheard Jessica in the cafeteria. Honestly, even without enhanced senses, I would have heard her. She and her friend speak pretty loudly when they're excited. Ah, he murmured, shrugging. That was before Bella got so close to Edward, but I don't mind. It'll be fun going with a friend. Alice nodded softly, as if she approved, though without making any direct judgment. Nate looked at her now with renewed curiosity. And you? Are you going? I don't think so, she replied, lowering her voice a bit. I've been to plenty of those dances. This year doesn't feel worth it. She paused, then added in a more confiding tone. Although, I always enjoy picking outfits for events like that. You like fashion? Nate asked, genuinely curious. Alice's reaction was instant, her eyes lit up with excitement, and her voice regained that vibrant tone that was so distinctly hers. I love it, she said with energy. Over the years, so many things start to feel static. But fashion always changes. There's always something new to try. It's like a form of movement, even when everything else stays still. Nate nodded, smiling, more because she seemed so genuinely animated than out of true understanding. Now I feel a bit guilty, I was just going to wear the first jacket and tie I found. Alice widened her eyes as if she had just heard a crime. You're going to do that to a lady? He chuckled softly. I'm pretty sure Bella will do the same and pick the first dress she sees. That's no excuse, she said with mock seriousness. It's common sense. You have to match the moment. And I don't mean jacket length. I'm guessing you'd have some ideas, he said, still smiling. Some. Alice replied, playfully. I have dozens. Nate raised his eyebrows, smirking. In that case, you should help me pick one. Alice blinked as if she hadn't expected the suggestion. Then she leaned forward, intrigued. What kind of suit do you want? He took a few seconds to think. To be honest, I'm more of a visual guy. I need to see it on to know if it works. There was a brief silence, and then he added, casually. So, why don't you come with me to pick one? Alice looked at him, clearly surprised, as if she wasn't sure if he was joking. Really? He nodded, expression calm. Yeah, I thought we could go to Port Angeles for a few hours after school. I heard there are some good stores over there, and well, since you know what you're talking about, I could really use your opinion. She seemed to consider it for a moment, her fingers playing with the edge of her notebook. Then, a soft, bright smile formed on her face. All right. I'd love to. Author's notes. Honestly, you're right that the pace suddenly slowed down. I uploaded several chapters today for the same reason. I won't upload chapters for a couple of days to get ahead on Patreon. The story will move forward faster, at least until I finish the first volume, which covers the first book. 3 comments 0 vote. Chapter 55. If you want to support to continue with the chapters and improve the quality of the language, or read some advanced chapters, this week I will upload several chapters to Patreon. Please follow me on patreon.com/Jayjayempi. After Alice agreed to go with him, it was as if all the energy she had lost the previous week, while avoiding him, had suddenly been restored. Her eyes sparkled with excitement, and although she tried to appear casual, Nate noticed how she smiled uncontrollably. So, see you there? She asked, with a smile that aimed to sound nonchalant, but revealed a hint of anticipation. He gently shook his head. I'd rather pick you up. Just text me what time. Alice blinked, clearly surprised by his reply. For a moment, something vulnerable flickered across her face before she recovered with a sheepish smile. Got it, she replied in a light tone, raising her hands as if surrendering. I'll text you as soon as I can. Just don't take a week to confirm, okay? She said that last part with a mischievous smile, her eyes gleaming with that playful spark Nate was only just beginning to recognize. He didn't answer with words, just a quiet smile that Alice seemed to understand. The bell rang then, and they both stood up almost at the same time. Well, see you later, she said, waving with a cheerful gesture, almost floating as she turned to leave. Her steps were light as if something inside her had been set free. Nate watched her walk away with a calm, almost thoughtful expression. He couldn't help but think that something in their conversation had brought her back to life, as if she had regained a piece of herself that had been dimmed. He adjusted his backpack over his shoulder and headed to his last class of the day, gym. When he arrived at the gym, he was immediately greeted by Mike, who clapped him on the shoulder with an unusually wide grin. Hey, Nate, he exclaimed, overflowing with enthusiasm. What's up? You in for some basketball today? Nate raised an eyebrow, slightly puzzled. Ever since their talk in La Push, Mike seemed like a different person. That constant tension was gone, the need to compete for every word, every look, every breath around Bella. Now, he just looked happy. Sure, Nate replied, matching the gesture with a small smile. Am I your opponent or your teammate today? Teammate, Mike replied quickly as if he had already decided. After last time's beating, I'm not ready to lose again. They played for a while. Nate noticed that although Mike wasn't exactly an athletic prodigy, he had a genuine energy that made everything more fun. They were winning, not that it really mattered. The fun was in the game itself, not the score. At one point, Nate stepped away from the group to grab some water. As he wiped the sweat from his brow with the back of his hand, he noticed Bella sitting on the side of the bleachers. Her head was down, elbows resting on her knees, and her expression seemed distant. Without overthinking it, he walked over and sat beside her. Taking a break? He asked softly, breaking the silence gently. Bella looked up. She gave him a weak, almost automatic smile. Something like that. There was a pause. Not uncomfortable, but charged with something unspoken. You don't look like someone excited for a girls' afternoon in Port Angeles, Nate commented, staring ahead. Bella let out a soft, ironic laugh. I'm not really in the mood, but it's as good a time as any to go. Nate glanced at her from the corner of his eye. It was obvious something was weighing on her. But instead of pressing, he chose kindness. He nudged her lightly with his shoulder, a playful little bump. If you get like this just because your boyfriend's gone for one day, I don't want to imagine what's going to happen if you end up in different colleges. Bella let out a genuine laugh, though brief. Technically, we're not even dating. And then, as if the comment had unlocked something more personal, her voice softened. Her words came out slower, more vulnerable. Nate, do you think I should stop pushing Edward to tell me the truth? I mean, what if I should just, I don't know, enjoy what we have? The question caught him off guard. He'd expected a complaint. Maybe a suspicion. But that was surrender dressed as acceptance. He looked ahead, at the group of students shooting hoops. Then back at her. If you think you can live with that, go for it, he said honestly, without harshness. But honestly, Bella, I don't think you're the kind of person who can stay calm without knowing. She didn't respond right away. She frowned, thoughtful as if his words had touched a nerve she'd been avoiding for days. Then she sighed. Not hurt, just acknowledging a truth she had already suspected. You might be right, she murmured, with a faint but resolute smile. They sat in silence for a few more seconds, comfortably. Then Bella glanced sideways at him, raising an eyebrow. Hey, speaking of Port Angeles, any chance you want to come with us today? Angela, Jessica, and I could use a guy's opinion. Plus, Jessica might help you pick out a suit. I'd offer to help too, but I'm hopeless in that department. Nate chuckled softly, shaking his head. Thanks, but I already have someone who's going to help me with that. Bella looked at him, curious. Oh yeah, who? But before she could ask more, Nate's phone buzzed. He pulled it from his pocket and read the message. Alice. See you 2 hours after school. P.S. I didn't take that long to confirm, did I? A smile slowly crept across his face. The message struck him as absurdly funny, they had literally just talked. Bella glanced at him, tilting her head with a perceptive smile. You look weirdly happy. Nate paused for a second. Was he happy? Just read something funny, he replied, slipping the phone back into his pocket and standing up to return to the game. Creation is hard, cheer me up. Jayjayempi creators' thoughts. 18 comments 0 vote. Chapter 56. If you want to support to continue with the chapters and improve the quality of the language, or read some advanced chapters, this week I will upload several chapters to Patreon, please follow me on patreon.com/jjmp. The final bell rang, and with it, Nate stepped out of the school building. The afternoon air was cold and crisp, a stark contrast to the contained bustle inside the high school. He walked toward his car at a measured pace, keys already in hand, as if trying not to think too much about what was coming next. While driving home, his mind remained silent for several minutes. The familiar road, flanked by perfectly aligned trees, felt alien to him, like the world didn't know he was hesitating. He had 2 hours before picking up Alice at the Cullen house, and though it was more than enough time, something inside him just couldn't relax. He had been the one to ask her to come along. Was he doing the right thing? Part of him kept wondering. He had already tried to avoid her, tried to keep things cold and distant. But today, for a moment in class, he had felt comfortable around her. So much so that, for brief seconds, he forgot what she was. And that worried him. Not because of her, but because of himself. He stopped at a red light and looked out the window. A pair of children crossed the street with backpacks larger than their backs. Nate sighed. It's just one afternoon. If I don't feel anything, if I confirm there's nothing more than a pleasant conversation, then it'll be easier to move on, he told himself. He gripped the steering wheel a little tighter, as a joyless smile crossed his face. He thought about Bella and Edward. At least she was ignorant of the danger she was getting into by getting so close. Nate, on the other hand, was heading right into it willingly, against all better judgment. I guess that makes me a hypocrite, he thought. The thought lingered, but it didn't torment him. He simply acknowledged it. At home, he allowed himself a hot shower. He paused a moment in front of the mirror afterward, looking at his fogged-up reflection. He combed his hair with more care than usual and chose clothes that weren't just functional. He thought about what Alice had said in class, about fashion. And though it annoyed him a little to admit it, she had planted a seed of doubt about his repeated shirts. Shaking off the thought, he gathered his things before heading out. He grabbed his phone and typed. On my way. The drive to the Cullen house felt longer than usual. Once there, he parked in front of the driveway and stepped out of the car, but didn't approach the house. It wasn't fear, it was instinct. Something inside told him getting too close wasn't a great idea. He respected their way of life, but he still couldn't ignore the natural tension he felt around them. As he reflected on this, the front door opened. Alice stepped out lightly, her serene smile in place, and her outfit, once again, completely different from the one she wore in class. Nate looked at her for a second and realized, he had never seen her repeat an outfit. She greeted him with a calm expression. Hi. I didn't think you'd be this punctual. Nate smiled before replying. So first I have a dangerous vibe, and now I'm rude too. He replied with humor, walking to the passenger side to open the door for her. More than courtesy, it was a habit that, unintentionally, was beginning to form. Alice raised her eyebrows slightly, a smile forming on her face. Maybe the rude part was a stretch, she said with a soft laugh as she climbed in. Nate closed the door behind her but reflexively noticed something near the house entrance. Through the slightly ajar door, Edward peeked out, wearing an unreadable expression. And in one of the windows, another face caught his attention, Rosalie. She watched him with a serious look, brow furrowed as if evaluating his presence. But her gaze didn't linger on him. It shifted to the car, eyes narrowing in focus as if she were examining it piece by piece. Nate frowned slightly. Alice, noticing the exchange, chuckled before explaining. Rosalie loves cars. She had her eye on yours for a while now. Nate nodded, a bit surprised. Seemed like she was dissecting it. She probably was, Alice replied, amused. It's what she does. The road stretched clean before the windshield, glistening from recent rain. Nate kept one hand on the wheel. The radio played quietly, a popular song, one of those that plays everywhere even if you don't know who sings it. Alice sat in the passenger seat, singing enthusiastically a few notes above the key. Not enough to be annoying, just enough to catch attention. Nate glanced at her sideways. Rather than being annoyed, he found it amusing. Do you always sing like that, or are you extra enthusiastic today? He asked with a faint smile. Alice looked at him, finishing the last line before replying. I'm in a good mood, she said simply. Her voice was light, but her eyes sparkled. It's refreshing to have a new model to dress. I've spent years handling my family's looks. A fresh perspective excites me. Nate gave a short laugh. And here I thought you were doing me a favor. Alice looked at him with a raised eyebrow, as if she already knew where he was going with that. But now that I've got the full picture, Nate continued, pretending to think, maybe I should charge you for modeling. Alice's laugh came instantly, clear as a bell. Even if that were the case, you'd be the one losing, she retorted smugly. There's no price for what I do. The atmosphere inside the car was easy. Comfortable. Alice leaned back a little more, gracefully crossing her legs. For a moment, she looked ahead and, as if lost in thought, let out a small laugh. Nate, curious, raised a brow and asked, glancing sideways. What's so funny? Alice, as if her thought was a little ridiculous, commented. I just find it funny how, a few weeks ago, we were all worried about the dangerous-minded human, she said in a playful, almost ironic tone. And now here I am, driving around with him looking for the perfect prom outfit. Nate slowed slightly as he entered a tight curve. His eyes stayed on the road, but his mind lingered on what Alice had just said. And she was right. He had been acting differently lately. There were several reasons, he was sure. The truce, until Bella discovered the truth, and, though he wouldn't admit it openly, the intrigue he felt when around Alice. With her, he didn't have to keep his guard up all the time. He didn't feel the need to analyze every word or gesture. He could speak, even joke, without it making him feel any less alert. In some way, it made him feel vulnerable again. The silence didn't last long. It might sound funny, Nate said at last, dragging the words with mock arrogance, but I think you're underestimating me. She raised her eyebrows, amused. They're dancing in the palm of my hand, he added, so seriously that Alice tensed for just a second, until she caught the gleam in his eyes. I'm just a few smiles away from not only having you pick my suit but also having you pay for it. Alice burst out laughing and gave him a sideways look, one eyebrow lifted. Her smile tilted playfully, but her answer came sharper than expected. I think you're overestimating yourself. You've got a nice face, I'll give you that, but not enough to fool a vampire. Nate let out a soft, incredulous chuckle. That's kind of unfair, don't you think? You guys are built to be attractive. It's like judging me for losing a race against a Ferrari. I'd say you're more of a Mustang. Rebellious. Loud, attitude, but still needs polishing. How flattering, Nate murmured with an ironic smile. But hey, I'm still 17. Maybe in a few years, with a bit of stubble, I'll be a better sight. Alice grew thoughtful for a moment, and though she tried to hide it, her smile softened as she imagined it. Something in her expression turned distant, calm, almost nostalgic. Nate noticed. Not so much the gesture, but the void that came with it. That kind of look that wasn't really in the present. He understood it too quickly. Aging must be a weird topic for you, huh? He said, feigning lightness but choosing his words carefully. I mean, talking about how my face might change in 5 years with you is like talking to a portrait. Alice blinked, snapping out of her brief trance. She didn't seem upset, just thoughtful. I guess so. You don't realize how fast the world moves, when you no longer do. He was quiet a moment, then asked softly, as if he didn't want to push but couldn't help his curiosity. How old were you when it happened? Alice looked forward as if calculating something. According to the records I found, I was 19, she said finally, without much emotion. Nate glanced at her, slightly surprised. Her face didn't match that age. There was something about her appearance that seemed eternally adolescent, a carefully crafted fragility. Really? He asked, openly surprised. You don't look it. I'd say, 16, tops. She laughed, this time with a more genuine tone. That's the old trick. Since we can't change, we adapt what we can. Hair, clothes, makeup, we learn to project whatever age helps us fit in. And right now, what age are you pretending to be? Alice shrugged, amused. Depends who's looking. To some, I'm a slightly precocious teen. To others, an eccentric college girl. You decide. Nate turned his eyes back to the road, smiling unintentionally. The rest of the drive passed surprisingly fast. Nate kept his hands steady on the wheel, focused on the road. Alice seemed calm beside him, looking out the window with a serene, almost pensive expression. There was something comforting about her silence, as if she didn't need to fill the space with words. Before he realized it, they were descending one of the main avenues of Port Angeles. The low buildings, unlit lampposts, and shop windows reflected the overcast sky. It was still daytime, but the gray weather gave the city a suspended-in-time atmosphere. Alice looked up and smiled. We've got plenty of time, she said. And this place has some decent stores. I've been here before, so trust me. Nate responded with a half smile while searching for a parking spot. I'll leave it to you. Just don't put me in anything too flashy. Alice let out a low laugh. I promise to restrain myself, a little. Once inside the first store, elegant without being pretentious, Nate barely had time to take in the interior before Alice gently pushed him toward a small couch in front of a full-length mirror. Sit here for a second, she said decisively. I'm going to find what you need. He obeyed without argument, watching her disappear among the racks at impressive speed. Shortly after, she returned with a young clerk about her age, who followed her with a pile of hangers in her arms. Alice moved through the store like she already knew every corner, picking out shirts, suits, and ties faster than the clerk could keep up. From time to time, she would approach Nate with a piece in hand. Stand up for a moment, she'd say bluntly. He did, while Alice looked him over silently, eyes narrowed, evaluating every proportion. Then she'd pivot and vanish again in search of more options. Nate simply watched her in the mirror, arms crossed and a faint smile slipping out without him meaning to. Seeing her so focused, so comfortable in the middle of the chaos, struck him as oddly fascinating. At that moment, Alice didn't seem like a supernatural creature at all. Or maybe she did, but not in the way he had imagined at first. And so the hours passed, store after store. Alice seemed tireless, as if time had no effect on her. Nate, on the other hand, was beginning to feel worn out, even though his role had been limited to walking around, trying on clothes, and receiving Alice's critical glances every 5 minutes. The sky over Port Angeles was already completely dark when they walked into the last store. The interior was softly lit with warm lamps that gave everything a cozy appearance. Nate collapsed into one of the chairs near the main mirror while Alice kept moving through the racks, still energized, scanning options with the same enthusiasm she'd had at the start. Nate let out a quiet exhale, half laughing to himself, so they don't get tired. As he discreetly massaged the bridge of his nose, he noticed one of the employees, a young girl, probably fresh out of high school, pretty and dressed to impress more than to sell, approaching him. Did they already abandon you here? She asked with a tilted, playful smile. Nate gave her a subtly surprised look. Usually, his serious expression was enough to keep conversations short, but this girl seemed immune to that signal. Not exactly, he replied politely, though his tone was more distant than warm. She sat on the edge of the chair next to his, leaning slightly toward him. I'm Dana, she said softly. My shift ends in a few minutes. Want to go for a walk after this? Nate blinked once. It wasn't that he didn't know what to say, he was just surprised by how direct she was. Studying her for a second, he noticed how her movements were carefully planned, her posture slightly curved toward him, and the way her eyes scanned his face waiting for a reaction. She was used to being told yes. She was confident in her looks. Thanks, but I don't think I can. I already have plans, he said kindly, without a hint of arrogance, just calm firmness. Confusion flickered briefly across Dana's face. She was about to say something else, maybe to recover ground, when Alice appeared behind them, glowing with excitement. This is the one, she announced, holding a neatly folded suit over her arm. Dana turned to look at her, and Nate didn't miss the reaction, the way her eyes widened slightly, scanning Alice from head to toe. Oh, she murmured in a smaller voice, like someone who'd just been reminded of a hierarchy she didn't quite understand, but her body instinctively recognized. Alice, unaware or simply indifferent to the moment, handed the suit to Dana with a light smile. Would you mind showing him to a fitting room, please? Of course, the girl replied, with a smile that tried to remain professional, though the light in her eyes had dimmed. This way. Nate followed Dana to the fitting room. The suit was light blue, elegant but subtle, paired with a matching tie. The pants were slightly fitted but suited him well. In the mirror, he raised an eyebrow. Not bad. Maybe Alice was right after all. When he stepped out of the fitting room, Alice was standing with her hands clasped in front of her. Upon seeing him, she clapped once, smiling. Perfect, she said brightly. You couldn't look better. Nate wasn't sure if he should smile or shrug, so he did both. Dana sighed quietly, resigned, and with a small gesture, pointed toward the register. You can pay over here. They walked out of the store with the suit bag in hand. Nate noticed the clerk, Dana, watching them as they left. Once in the car, and as he started the engine, Nate broke the silence with a casual question. Mind if I stop to grab something to eat? I haven't had a bite since school. Alice shook her head, settling elegantly into the seat. Of course not. Go ahead. He drove a few blocks and stopped at a small stand that still had its lights on. He ordered a hot dog with everything, and as he took the first bite inside the car, Alice watched him in silence, elbow resting on the door, chin on her hand. I'm sorry, she said suddenly. For what? Nate asked between bites. I realized too late that the salesgirl was interested in you. I might have scared her off by accident. Nate shrugged, brushing it off. It's fine. I wasn't interested anyway. Alice tilted her head, intrigued. I remember you once said you liked sweet girls, but you never mentioned what kind of look you're into. Nate frowned slightly as if he'd never seriously thought about it. I don't know. I guess, like everyone, I like a pretty girl, but there are hundreds of pretty girls. What matters is the connection, right? Alice smiled, amused. Then why don't you like Bella? She's pretty. And you definitely have a connection. Nate laughed, wiping his mouth with a napkin, and murmured with a touch of humor. Honestly, Bella's cute and nice, but she's practically a carbon copy of her dad. Alice burst out laughing, covering her mouth. That was cruel. You say that because you don't have to deal with both of them, he replied with a grin. She glanced sideways at him, still amused, and added playfully. But there must be some physical trait you like in girls. Nate thought for a second. I guess I like girls with black hair. Alice slowly turned her head toward the window, smiling to herself. But Bella has, she began, then stopped. Her eyes were unfocused for a moment, the playful glint vanishing. Suddenly, they grew glassy. Nate noticed instantly, his body tensing. What's wrong? Alice blinked quickly as if waking from a bad premonition. Her voice came out shaky, almost a whisper. It's Bella. She might be in danger. She reached into her bag, searching frantically. I need to warn Edward, she muttered, but her face twisted in frustration. Damn it, I forgot I left my phone at home. Nate straightened in his seat, tossing the wrapper aside. Where is she? Is she far from here? Alice turned toward him, nodding quickly as she spoke fast. No. If I'm picking this up right, she's somewhere downtown, probably near the alley between the bookstore and that old record store. Then tell me how to get there, Nate said without hesitation, starting the engine with determination. Alice looked him straight in the eyes, and for an instant, she seemed to weigh multiple thoughts. Then she nodded seriously. Drive. I'll guide you. Creation is hard, cheer me up. Jayjayempi Creators Thoughts. 32 comments 0 vote. Chapter 57. If you want to support to continue with the chapters and improve the quality of the language, or read some advanced chapters, this week I will upload several chapters to Patreon. Please follow me on patreon.com/jjmp. The car slid quickly through the dark streets of Port Angeles, the lights of the shops turning off one by one as if the city itself wanted to fall asleep early. Nate had a deep frown on his face, one hand firmly on the wheel, while Alice stared out the window, uneasy. How soon will something happen to her? Nate asked, eyes still fixed on the road. Alice took a second to respond. I'm not sure, but I don't think it'll take long. She pointed for him to take a side street. The library's that way, a little further ahead. Nate turned the wheel. Even though it was late, there were still a few people out, but the atmosphere had shifted. The area was quieter and more deserted, and the streetlights barely lit the alleys. Nate didn't like places like this. They drove a couple more blocks until Alice raised her voice, pointing toward a particularly dark area. There. Nate slammed on the brakes. Bella was walking quickly down the opposite sidewalk, constantly looking over her shoulder. Less than 20 steps behind her, 4 men were following. They walked fast, picking up their pace once they realized she had seen them. One of them whistled. Another laughed. Nate didn't hesitate. He cut the engine immediately. They both got out of the car. Bella's steps grew more frantic, and when she saw Nate, her eyes widened in relief. She ran toward him. Nate. The men saw her reaction and also began to run after her. But Nate was already moving toward them, cutting them off. Alice, composed as ever, went around Bella and took her by the arm. Come with me. To the car. Bella obeyed without protest, visibly shaken. Alice cast one last glance at Nate. They're not worth it. Let's go. But he didn't respond. His gaze was fixed on the 4 men who had now stopped in front of him. He studied their posture, their weight, their intent. The biggest one was broad-shouldered, almost as tall as Nate, with a clenched jaw and narrowed eyes. He was analyzing, deciding if he'd have to fight or if a shove would do. The other 3, shorter but full of cocky bravado, moved with confidence. One of them laughed. Whoa, calm down big guy, we just wanted to talk to your friend, not fair that you already have one and now you're coming for ours. Nate said nothing. The silence around him was thick, like a taut rope ready to snap. He took one step toward them, fists still down. Leave. His voice was low, and controlled but full of a tension that seemed to vibrate from deep in his chest. The 4 men paused for just a second. One, the youngest, stepped half a pace back. Another looked nervously at the big one, the leader, who only raised an eyebrow before sneering, arms crossed. Nate didn't insist. He simply turned calmly, ready to walk back to the car. In his mind, he'd already decided not to waste more time. But the leader didn't let him go. He placed a heavy hand on Nate's shoulder. Hey, don't be like that. At least leave as the little girl with the weird eyes. The touch was enough. Nate spun cleanly on his heel, and with the momentum from his hips, delivered a right hook that exploded against the man's jaw like a hammer. The man staggered to the side, reeling, but 2 of the others were already charging at him. Nate took a step back, eyes blazing, fists raised. He was ready. One came in with a sloppy punch. Nate ducked and countered with a hook to the stomach. The guy doubled over with a grunt and took an uppercut to the chin that dropped him instantly. The next one tried to attack him from behind, but Nate spun sharply, using the turn to drive a cross into the man's cheekbone, knocking him down on the spot. 2 on the ground. Nate focused on the one who hadn't moved, and took a step forward, but the leader, now back on his feet, took advantage of the distraction and grabbed him with both arms, trying to restrain him. Slice this bastard up. He shouted furiously. The 4th man, the one who had hesitated earlier, pulled a knife from his pocket. Nate struggled, but the grip was strong. There was no time for technique. With a sharp breath, Nate threw his head back with force, hitting the man behind him hard enough to loosen the grip. He spun his arm, and with an elbow strike, hit the leader square in the cheek. He felt the crack of bone, heard a muffled groan, and then the weight of the body collapsing unconscious. Luckily, the spin was well timed, though not perfect. The last man's blade grazed his arm, slicing through the sleeve and leaving a burning red line. The final attacker stood frozen, eyes wide, knife trembling in his hand, staring at his unconscious companions. Nate raised his fists again, analyzing his stance, waiting for the next move. He was already calculating how to disarm him without getting stabbed. But then, a gust of air made him blink. Alice appeared behind the man in a whisper. She extended her arm with elegant precision and struck him on the back of the head with an open palm. The man collapsed like a puppet with its strings cut. Nate lowered his arms, panting, blood still trickling from the cut. He blinked, confused. Alice, why did you enter? But when he looked at her, he understood. She was frozen, eyes wide. Her gaze was fixed on the ground, or more accurately, on the blood. His blood. The golden hue of her eyes trembled, shifting to a dark amber. Her jaw was tight. The air around her had grown heavier. Go, she murmured as if struggling to hold something back. Take Bella. Now. Alice. Bella called from the car door. Then, a sound. A car. The silver Volvo appeared on the street, tires screeching as it turned sharply. It stopped right in front of them, and Edward stepped out immediately, covering his nose and mouth with one hand. He went straight to Alice, saying nothing. He gently took her by the shoulders, keeping his focus, and began guiding her to the passenger seat. Before getting in, Edward looked up at Nate. Their eyes met for a second. Then he turned his gaze to Bella. Nate saw the flood of emotions cross his face, rage, relief, and finally, regret. Without wasting another moment, Edward got into the car and sped off with Alice. Nate exhaled slowly. The pain in his arm was beginning to set in. The blood was still dripping. Creation is hard, cheer me up. Jayjayempi creators thoughts. 38 comments 0 vote. Chapter 58. If you want to support to continue with the chapters and improve the quality of the language, or read some advanced chapters, this week I will upload several chapters to Patreon. Please follow me on patreon.com/jjmp. Blood was still dripping down Nate's arm when he heard the car door slam shut. Bella stood in front of him. Her face was pale, eyes wide, breathing ragged. It wasn't just worry on her face, it was fear. And something deeper, the confirmation of a suspicion. What was that? She asked, barely a whisper, but her voice was tight with tension. How did she do that? Nate didn't answer right away. He made sure the men were unconscious, then looked at her, silent, with the same heavy stillness he'd used against their attackers. But Bella didn't need him to speak. Not this time. She was right next to me, she continued, stepping forward. Alice. She was by my side. And a second later, she was behind that guy. She hit him before he could even react. That's not human, Nate. Nate looked down, pressing his wound with his other hand. He stayed silent. Did you see it? She pressed, nearly breathless. Did you see her? Did you see what she did? Nate gave a slight nod, unshaken. That calm unnerved her. And you're this calm. Her voice broke in disbelief. You're not going to say anything. You're not going to react. Nate raised his eyes. There's nothing new to process, Bella. Her eyes widened. She stepped closer. You knew. She demanded. How long have you known, Nate? He took a deep breath. For a while. And you didn't tell me. Her anger flared like fire. You watched me get close to them. Edward, you saw me doubt, question, obsess, and you just stayed quiet. It wasn't my place to tell you. Bella stepped back, bringing her hands to her face. Her eyes burned. Her heart pounded like she'd just woken up in another world. And in some way, she had. So it's true, she murmured to herself. They're real. They're vampires. Nate's silence was confirmation. Bella slowly lowered her hands. Something in her expression shifted. It wasn't panic anymore. Or anger. It was something else. Fascination. Awe. Almost admiration. It all makes sense, she said in a soft, almost reverent voice. The way they move. The way they feel. Edward. Nate watched her face slowly transform, settling into a cold, firm resolution. I want him to tell me, she said, turning to Nate. I want Edward to confirm it. I don't care what he is. I need to hear it from him. The reaction was instant. Nate lowered his hand from his wound like it no longer hurt and looked at her with restrained fury. That's your decision? He asked in a low, tense voice. After finally learning what they are, the only thing you want is to see him. Bella frowned. What are you implying? I'm saying you almost got hurt today. Or worse. And your first instinct isn't to back away, or protect yourself, it's to run toward the monster who could destroy you. I'm not afraid. I know him. He's not like that, she said firmly. That's the problem. Nate snapped. You're not afraid when you should be. You don't know what they are. You don't know what they're capable of. And you don't know what I feel for him. Bella yelled. You don't get it, Nate. You can't. Nate looked at her, his eyes burning not just with anger, but something deeper, pain. I don't get it. You really think that? His voice dropped, steadier. Maybe I don't understand what you feel, but I understand him. He's dangerous. He knows it. He admitted it. The only one who doesn't want to see it, is you. Bella felt her blood ignite. She stepped forward, defiant. So what do you expect me to do? Reject him. Run away from him. I can't, Nate. I won't. I know him more than you think, and he's not the monster you describe. Nate clenched his jaw. More than I think. He repeated with a bitter laugh. Bella, you know the version he chose to show you. Do you know what I saw when I talked to him? Someone who hates himself. Who's constantly on the edge. Who's afraid he'll hurt you, not because he doesn't care, but because he does. Bella shook her head, her voice barely audible. That's not true. It is. Nate shouted. He told me so himself. He knows it's wrong to be near you. Bella looked at him as if he'd slapped her. Her expression changed, not doubt. Pain. You talked to him, about me. Nate nodded, not looking away. Yes. I made it clear I wouldn't let him hurt you. But look at you now. You don't even care if he does. All you want is to understand him. To justify him. Because I love him, she cried. Her words echoed in the air. Nate said nothing. For a moment, only the distant wind filled the space between them. Bella lowered her gaze as if realizing, for maybe the first time, the weight of what she'd just admitted. And you talk like love is a weakness. Like protecting me is more important than letting me choose. Nate stepped toward her, frustrated. You don't know. Bella, God, you're still a teenager. You barely know him and you're willing to risk everything. He growled. And you know what's worse. Bella opened her mouth, but he didn't let her respond. You're willing to gamble your life, and the lives of the people who love you. Have you thought about that, Bella? About your dad? Your mom? Do you think they'll understand if one day you don't come home? Do you think they'll breathe easy when you disappear with him? Because that's what's going to happen, sooner or later. And you don't even see it. His words hit hard. Bella looked down. The mention of her parents, of the world outside Forks, made her falter. Nate stepped closer, firmer. I know what it's like to lose someone. To be left with nothing, wishing you'd done something differently. My parents were gone, and I couldn't do a thing. But you can still avoid it. You can stop yourself from leaving behind the people who love you, just to chase something that, whether you like it or not, is going to destroy everything in its path. There was a tense silence. For a moment, Bella seemed to waver. His words had reached her. But then her gaze sharpened. And what about you? She said suddenly, sharp. You talk so much about choices, didn't you do the same? You're being a hypocrite. You were with Alice, even knowing what they are. And you still chose to be with her. Nate froze. The blow was direct. Oh, so it's fine because you made the choice. You can be close to one of them, but I can't be with Edward. Nate closed his eyes, and took a deep breath. You're right, he admitted bluntly. It's hypocritical. I know that. Things escalated before I realized it. At first, I was committed to getting them out of here, to stopping them from being a threat, but I can't keep pretending. I'd be lying if I said I didn't enjoy her company. Bella frowned, something between confusion and sadness. It's like a pull, Nate added. That desire to be near them, even if you know it might destroy you. I understand it more than you think. It's addictive. Almost electric, the way it feels. Then why judge me? Bella whispered, hurt. Because you still have something to lose, Nate replied without hesitation. Because you still have a family. A place to come back to, and it seems like you don't care. There was silence. Long, cold, intense. Until Bella lowered her gaze, and murmured. You do too. You have your grandma, Charlie, Jake, and me. Nate swallowed hard. His wound burned, but not as much as the words he had just heard. For a second, neither of them knew what to say. And that, in the middle of everything, was the most honest thing they shared that night. Author's notes. Lately the bad comments have been discouraging me a lot. I've seen a lot of fanfics that I really liked drop because of it. I try to focus on the good comments, which are the majority, to continue with this. But sometimes it's hard not to feel bad for the bad ones. So I'm just leaving you a message. If you like the story as it goes, I really appreciate it. I have every intention of finishing it. If that's the opposite case and you don't like the direction it's taking or the time it takes or whatever, I want you to know that I appreciate you reading so far. I'm sure there are thousands more fanfics out there that you'll like, and I would appreciate it if you didn't launch direct attacks on what I write. I have no problem with criticism. Those who comment know that I take the time to answer questions or clarify things and that I recognize when something I posted is wrong or doesn't make sense, but comments against me or just pointless complaints are not welcome. Sorry for the long note. Regards. Jayjayempi. 70 comments 0 vote. Chapter 59. If you want to support to continue with the chapters and improve the quality of the language, or read some advanced chapters, this week I will upload several chapters to Patreon. Please follow me on patreon.com/jjmp. The air had become unbreathable, thick like a storm about to break. Nate and Bella were still there, surrounded by silence, broken only by their ragged breathing, until a pair of voices interrupted everything. Hey, are you okay? A man shouted from across the street, eyes wide as he took in the scene before him. It was an older couple. They had stopped when they saw the four men lying unconscious on the ground, blood staining their clothes and bruises covering their faces. The woman gasped and pulled out her phone with trembling hands. Call the police. Now. The man demanded, stepping back as he eyed Nate with visible suspicion. Nate didn't answer. He simply made sure none of the attackers were moving. He stood firm, taking deep breaths as if the weight of the night was only now beginning to press down on him. Bella took a few steps away, crossing her arms. Her face was still tense. Nate didn't look at her. He couldn't. In less than 10 minutes, the silence was replaced by sirens, flashing lights, and urgent voices. Patrol cars arrived. Red and blue lights flooded the street. An officer stepped out immediately and approached Bella. Are you all right, miss? Yes. Thank you, she replied, her voice steady even though her hands were shaking. The officer looked at the men on the ground, then at Nate, who was bleeding from his arm. You took them on yourself. Nate nodded silently. The oldest of the attackers, a burly man with a weathered face, was identified almost instantly. He had a record for assault, and the other three weren't strangers to the law either. Bella's version of events, clear and direct, eliminated any doubt that might have been cast on Nate. As the men were cuffed and loaded into the patrol cars, a paramedic approached. Do you want us to take you in to get checked out? It's not necessary, Nate replied. It's not deep. Just a cut. The paramedic looked at him skeptically, but at his insistence, handed him some bandages and antiseptic. Bella remained a few meters away, unmoving. She didn't come closer. And Nate didn't try either. They stayed that way, until a familiar car screeched to a halt at the edge of the street. Charlie Swan stepped out before the engine even stopped. His expression was tense, filled with fear, but also unwavering determination. He walked straight to Bella and hugged her tightly, checking her over for any sign of injury. She let herself be held, saying nothing. Then Charlie looked up and saw Nate. For a moment, he simply stared at Nate, shirt torn, arm crudely bandaged, eyes downcast. Without another word, Charlie walked toward him and embraced him. A firm hug. One of gratitude. Thank you, he murmured. For protecting her. Again. Nate stiffened. He only responded with a small nod. Charlie returned to Bella and led her to the car. Just before getting in, she turned briefly toward Nate. She didn't meet his eyes, but her lips moved, barely. Thank you. The ride home felt endless. Much longer than the way there. The makeshift bandage burned, but Nate didn't complain. He kept his eyes fixed on the road. When he finally arrived home, it was already well past midnight. The porch lights were still on. His grandmother was waiting in the rocking chair, a blanket over her legs and a cup of cold tea in her hands. She didn't say a word when he walked in. Didn't question him either. She just looked at him. An intense gaze. Silent. Full of worry. Nate lowered his eyes. He knew the police had called her. But she only gave him a faint smile. He noticed how her gaze briefly flicked to the bandage on his arm, then quickly returned to meet his before she spoke. I boiled some water. In case you need anything, she said softly at last. He nodded, passed by her without a word and went upstairs without looking back. In his room, everything felt too quiet. As if nothing had happened. As if the world hadn't changed so much in a single night. He took off his jacket. Opened the first aid kit and, patiently, removed the bandage. Cleaned the wound. Grit his teeth against the sting. Then he wrapped it, this time more carefully. As if it were a ritual. He sat on the edge of the bed. And then it all hit him. The fight with Bella. The things they said. The things they didn't. He had wanted to protect her. Yes. But he had also wanted to be right. To assert himself. To scare her into staying away. He hadn't realized when he'd started becoming like this, controlling. Petty. Unable to trust anything but his judgment. He had begun acting out of fear. Out of loss. He remembered his own words, you still have something to lose. And for the first time, he understood he wasn't talking about her. He was talking about himself. About how he'd closed himself off so much that he forgot how much his own life still mattered. Maybe Bella was right, at least she acted out of love. He, on the other hand, clung to everything that gave him control. He had stopped opening his heart. And started locking others in. All under the excuse of protecting them. As if only he knew what was best. Bella wanted to choose. And he wanted to choose for her. He sighed, covering his face with a hand. I'm a hypocrite, he muttered. And he was. For still seeing Alice. For knowing what she was, and still seeking her out. All under the excuse of confirming that what he felt wasn't real. And now that he thought about it, that excuse sounded weak. Ridiculous. He had promised to follow his grandmother's advice. But he kept interfering. Kept trying to make everything turn out the way he wanted. The hours passed. And his mind wouldn't stop. He wouldn't go to school the next day. Not out of cowardice. Not to avoid Bella. Not to dodge Alice. But because he needed to think. To breathe. To reevaluate. To accept that his pain didn't come just from losing his parents, but from the terrifying fear of losing someone else. And because, for the first time in a long while, he wanted to do things right. Creation is hard, cheer me up. Jayjayempi creators thoughts. 24 comments 0 vote. Chapter 60. If you want to support to continue with the chapters and improve the quality of the language, or read some advanced chapters, this week I will upload several chapters to Patreon. Please follow me on patreon.com/jayjayempi. Alice Pav. The world passed by in a stream of light and shadow through the windshield. Alice didn't see the road. She didn't see Edward. She only saw the blood. The bright red that had stained the air. The heat in her throat. The exact moment when she stopped being herself, and became that. It's okay, Edward sighed softly, even though she hadn't spoken. It's over. Alice didn't answer. Her fingers dug into her knees, stiff like claws. If she closed her eyes, she saw it again. The gash on Nate's arm, the scent that hit her like a punch, the impulse that surged through her like a current. Just one more step, just one more breath, and she would have lost control. Edward turned toward the forest and stopped the car. He turned off the engine. Outside, there was no one, only dark trees, the rustling wind, and guilt. I'm sorry, Alice whispered, barely audible. Edward didn't respond right away. He knew she wasn't speaking to him. She was talking to herself. I thought I could handle it, she went on. I thought I had more control. I've been fine for so long. It caught you off guard, Edward sighed gently. It was too fresh, too close. That's no excuse, she murmured. Her breathing grew unsteady, even though she didn't need it. Just another ghostly reflex of her lost humanity. Edward watched her in silence. His mind, open like a river, gave her glimpses, scattered and cloudy, images of the scene, the trembling in her hands, Nate's face. The fear. He didn't think that, Edward sighed at last. He didn't think you were a monster. He was more worried about you than himself. Alice shut her eyes tight. That's worse. Edward tilted his head, confused. He saw me shake. He saw me hesitate. He tried to come closer, to help me, even while bleeding. And Edward, I almost lunged at him. She clenched her fists, the shame burning inside her like fire. How can anyone trust us after that? Because you didn't, Edward answered firmly. Because you fought it. Because you stopped. Alice leaned back in her seat. The cold leather against her back contrasted with the heat in her chest. Silence settled like a weight. A familiar one. One she'd known for decades. Finally, she turned to look at him. I'm sorry, about Bella. Now she knows the truth. She was going to find out anyway. If you two hadn't stepped in, I would've. I'd been following her for a while, hoping things wouldn't escalate. If you hadn't been there, who knows what I might have done. Edward's expression tensed. Those men were lucky. They should have died tonight. Alice looked at him for a few seconds before adding, heavily. Still, I think we could have exposed ourselves to Bella under less stressful circumstances. Edward nodded slowly. He didn't look upset. Just tired. Empty. I was going to tell her anyway. Tomorrow. Alice looked at him, surprised. You've decided. Edward kept his gaze fixed on the darkness of the forest. Yes. I don't want to keep lying to her. I've decided I want to be with her. Alice tensed. The visions came back like shards of glass. The meadow, the golden light through the trees, Bella at the center, and two paths. One beautiful. The other is bloody. What if it ends badly? She asked in a low voice. What if you hurt her? I won't, Edward sighed without blinking. I can't live in this limbo anymore, Alice. I can't keep pushing her away out of fear of what I am. I tried. It didn't work. She deserves to know, and to choose. Alice lowered her gaze. She said nothing more. She stayed there, sitting beside Edward in the silent Volvo, long after the conversation had ended. He didn't push her. He knew when silence was the only comfort left. When they finally returned home, she didn't even go inside. She just took off running. Into the forest, like a shadow fleeing from itself. She spent hours hunting. A fox. Then a deer. Then another. She didn't even need that much, but the motion, the animal blood in her throat, kept her away from the most painful memory, the bright red flash on Nate's arm. His face. The way he looked at her. Not with fear, but with compassion. That hurt more than if he had run away. At some point in the early morning, she perched on a high branch, her forehead resting on her knees, and simply thought. She thought about him. About how everything had progressed so fast, at first cautiously, studying each other, and then how they began to speak with disarming honesty, how they laughed together, how the conversation always felt engaging. Another memory surfaced, the day they almost kissed. She had it tucked away like a whisper she didn't dare repeat, but it returned every time she was alone. She was the one who pulled away afterward. He had taken the first step to close the distance a week later, no resentment, no questions. And she had accepted. She admitted to herself that being with him was intriguing. He was multifaceted, kind, intelligent, even funny. A completely unpredictable point in her life. Someone beyond her visions. Something that could be dangerous, or good. Something different. And now, she had ruined it all. All for one moment. For one reflex. For what she was, at her core. A creature who, no matter how well she pretended, still had a monster sleeping beneath her skin. Alice had long ago made peace with what she was. It was, after all, the only thing she had ever truly known. But now, for the first time in decades, she understood the torment her brother lived with. When she walked into the house, it was already morning. She didn't see anyone. She changed quickly, got ready like usual, and went downstairs to join her siblings on the way to school. Jasper stood by the door. His eyes found her instantly. She felt his gift brush against her, offering a wave of calm. She didn't respond. She shook her head. She didn't want that favor. Not yet. For now, she wanted to feel the guilt that was eating her alive. Jasper, reluctantly, seemed to accept her choice. The school day was unbearably normal. Classes, hallways, laughter. Notes passed from desk to desk. The routine was spinning as if nothing had happened the night before. As if she hadn't almost attacked someone. As if she hadn't crossed an invisible line she now had no idea how to erase. At lunch, she saw Edward and Bella sitting at a table by the windows. Edward was speaking quietly, but Alice heard every word. I'll tell you everything you need to know after class. Bella simply nodded. No anxiety. No rush. As if she already knew. Alice noticed how Bella seemed so focused on their conversation that she didn't see anything around her. And she couldn't blame her. Everything was the same as always. Except for one thing. Nate wasn't there. Not in the halls. Not in class. Not in the corner of the table where he sat when he didn't feel like talking to anyone. He wasn't there. The absence hit her too hard. He didn't come because of me. Alice lowered her gaze to her hands, feeling something tighten in her lifeless chest. She felt stupid for everything. For looking at him that way. For getting so close. And more than anything, for enjoying it. And now. Now she probably wouldn't see him again. The thought chilled her. What if all I did was confirm everything he feared about us? She felt like she had destroyed everything good between them. And against all logic, against all caution, she took out her phone. Hesitated. Her finger trembled a second before she dared to type. I know you don't want to talk to me. And I get it. I just wanted to say I'm sorry. Really sorry. She stared at it. Once, twice. Her thumb hovered over the send button. And in the end, she pressed it. She sent it. Closed the phone. Put it away. She wasn't expecting a reply. But he needed to know. Even if it was in silence. Creation is hard, cheer me up. Jayjayempi creators thoughts.